Your lecturer is Amanda M. Rosen. She is an associate professor of politics and international relations at Webster University. She has been recognized with numerous teaching awards, including the William T. Kemper Award for Teaching Excellence.
Welcome to the study of research methods. Since the subject piqued your interest, I'm guessing you want to learn how to conduct effective research for some specific purpose, maybe for an assignment at work or a project you've undertaken on your own. You've come to the right place. I've got all kinds of useful techniques that I want to share with you. But I wonder whether you've paused to consider why research methods are so vitally important, not just to you, but to science, to society, to all of human civilization. Now, when I talk about research methods, I'm not just referring to experiments with test tubes and beakers or statistical analysis. I'm referring to all the many ways that we systematically study anything to better understand it, to uncover new information about it, or to explain why things happen as they do, whether that's how animals, plants, or minerals behave, why people think or act as they do, or why social, political, and economic systems work one way and not another. Whatever the application, using the right research methods can make the difference between obtaining reliable results or dangerously misleading information. We live in an era that depends heavily on accurate data for decisions that sometimes affect millions of lives. So it's no exaggeration to say that understanding and being able to apply rigorous research methods has become essential to everything from interpreting the day's news, to making good economic policy, to safeguarding our planet for future generations. That's why I think everyone should study this subject. Now, it wasn't so long ago that most people in positions of authority lacked any understanding of the value of good research methods. Science as we know it played only a marginal role in society, and consider what a difference that makes. Imagine for a moment that it's the mid-19th century and you're living in London, England. Queen Victoria is on the throne. We're talking less than 2 centuries ago, yet there are no cars, no mobile phones, no Game of Thrones. Well, no fictional Game of Thrones anyway. Running water, indoor plumbing, and toilets have only just been invented, and they're limited to the wealthy. So if you want water for cooking, washing, or cleaning, you have to go to the communal well or stream, just like all of your neighbors. Your life expectancy? It's about 40 years due to rampant infant mortality and disease. Let's all take a moment to be grateful for modern medical care. But how did we get that modern medical care, which has doubled life expectancy since 1850? It was through medical research, a systematic study of the human body, diseases, and medicines that led to breakthroughs that allow us to live longer and healthier lives today. How did research become commonplace in the field of medicine? Well, one key step along the way was a massive outbreak of cholera, more than 500 cases that occurred in August 1854 in Soho, near what is now a well-known shopping area in London, just north of Piccadilly Circus. Cholera is a dangerous disease, an acute kind of diarrheal infection, and the World Health Organization notes that if left untreated, it can kill its victims within hours. Worldwide, as of this taping, between 21,000 and 143,000 people die of cholera every year, most of them in underdeveloped areas that lack proper water and sanitation infrastructure. The main cause of cholera is drinking contaminated water. Wait a second, how do I know that? How does the World Health Organization know that cholera is caused by drinking contaminated water? Well, we know it is due to the efforts of a hero named Jon Snow, not, I promise, the character on Game of Thrones. An obstetrician in Victorian London, Snow believed that cholera, which killed tens of thousands of people in England during various outbreaks starting in 1831, was caused by water contaminated by sewage. But the experts of the time didn't agree. They were convinced that cholera was due to bad air or miasma. These are the same folks, by the way, who thought that the way to treat most sickness was to cut open a vein and allow leeches to suck out the illness. Luckily, John Snow had rigorous method. Through careful observation and the compilation of detailed data, he determined that August 1854 outbreak in Soho centered around a water pump at the intersection of Broad and Cambridge Streets. He hypothesized that the water in the Broad Street pump was contaminated, and that therefore those who became sick would be limited to those exposed to water from that pump. He investigated the victims, tracing their infection back to the pump. He also investigated the non-victims, those who lived or worked nearby but did not contract cholera. And he discovered that they had access to a different well or water source. So this helped him eliminate alternative explanations for why some contracted cholera and others didn't. Snow used the results of his research to convince local officials to remove the handle from the pump so it couldn't be used. And the outbreak ended. Hooray for science, research, and methods! Snow's systematic study of the cholera outbreak helped determine the true cause of a recurring health crisis, which led to a solution. Now, I wish I could say that every scientist from that point on accepted Snow's work and his explanation of the causes of cholera. Unfortunately, 20 years later, experts continued to claim that bad air was the main cause of cholera. Only after more researchers confirmed Snow's claims did a general acceptance of the theory of contaminated water occur. Research, as we shall see, is incremental and cumulative, and requires continual testing, retesting, and debate. But ultimately, it is through the application of sound research methods and principles that we advance our understanding of the world, and sometimes save lives. The world of medical and other scientific history is full of examples like this, cases where pre-existing and incorrect beliefs are challenged by the application of sound research methods. Once upon a time, the world was believed to be hollow and flat and full of sea monsters. The Earth was the center of the solar system, and the sun revolved around it. The seasons changed because Persephone, the goddess of the spring, had to spend 6 months of the year in the underworld with her husband Hades. Smoking doesn't cause cancer. All of these are ideas that were once held by experts of the day, but were discredited thanks to rigorous research. What do all these examples show us? It's simple. They show us that how we discover information about the world matters just as much as what we learn. All of our knowledge and opinions are grounded in what we know of the world. But how do we know it? It's only through the use of systematic study that we can be confident that what we know to be true is actually true. And that confidence is essential in enabling us to act and build on our knowledge and transform our lives. That's what makes the study of research methods so important, and as you'll see, so deeply fascinating. It helps us see the inner workings of how knowledge is created. It's the difference between accepting facts without question. For example, ideas about how the human body works that you probably learned in school, such as that we breathe to obtain oxygen, that our hearts beat to pump our blood, that our brains are the control centers for our bodies, and understanding why we know those things to be correct. Did you know that Aristotle thought that the heart, not the brain, controlled sensation and movement? Having never dissected human bodies, he drew the wrong conclusions about the purposes of human organs. And that's Aristotle. Imagine how well the rest of us would do without proper method. Research methods aren't just for scientists, of course. Method, having a systematic approach to answering a question or solving a puzzle, is useful in all kinds of areas and professions. A study of best practices in business, a journalistic investigation of what happened in a particular town, a lawyer checking up on recent case law, that's research too. Great fictional detectives rely on research methods as well. Sherlock Holmes notes that his friend Watson knows my methods, the ones that he applies to all of his investigations. Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot, meanwhile, insists on order and method as he uses his little gray cells to identify a killer. The methods that we will discuss in this course are broadly applicable to all kinds of research. Since method is our focus, let's take a more systematic look at the subject of research. Although there are many ways to classify it, generally it's divided into two broad categories that you may already be familiar with: basic research and applied research. Basic research, also known as fundamental or pure research, aims at answering questions that lead to gains in knowledge, understanding, and prediction. It's about advancing our general knowledge of how the world works. If you want to understand the fundamental building blocks of the universe, or why some people get married and others don't, or the communication techniques of dolphins, or why some businesses succeed or others fail, or the impact of the invention of gunpowder, then you want to do basic research. Applied research, in contrast, aims at answering questions that lead to direct and practical applications in the world. Applied research uses the findings of basic research to develop practical solutions aimed at changing the world. If you want to invent a medicine that cures cancer, or find ways to reduce energy consumption, develop a new product, create a new school curriculum or business plan, or design a park or building, your research will be applied. Applied research should be grounded in the findings of basic research, though. You wouldn't want to create a business plan unless you knew what made some businesses succeed and others fail. The two are therefore interrelated. Another way of looking at research is focusing on the type of inquiry. There's exploratory, descriptive, and explanatory research. Exploratory research, as the name suggests, focuses on initial exploration. We typically do this as a precursor to other types of research to learn more about a topic or problem or what others have had to say about it. Maybe you want to study something about terrorism, but you don't know what. Doing some exploratory research by reviewing the scholarly literature and seeing what kind of data and other studies are out there would be a good start. Descriptive research is when you attempt to describe something in detail, but you're not necessarily aiming at explaining why something is the way it is. One way of thinking about it is that descriptive research aims at answering questions like who, what, when, and where. You might describe the television viewing or purchasing habits of a group, or the demographics of your town, or what kind of flora and fauna are found in your local park compared to the one you might visit on vacation. Or you might describe the history of terrorist activity in a particular country. Explanatory research can be a natural follow-up to descriptive research. It aims at more of the why and how. The goal here is to evaluate cause and effect and explain why and how things work the way they do. So here your study might not focus on describing terrorist activity, but explaining it. Why in this country and not that one? Why these groups and not those groups? Why now and not then? That's explanatory research. Still, another distinction in types of research is between quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative work, as the term suggests, focuses on analyzing large amounts of data that can be readily expressed in numbers. Qualitative work can also have numbers, but usually involves data that is not easily boiled down to numbers, and therefore tends to focus on a smaller number of cases or subjects. Quantitative work generally allows for greater breadth in the number of cases and variables that you study, while qualitative work sacrifices some of that breadth for the sake of depth, really digging into each case and variable that you study. Now, scholars and practitioners can get into very heated debates over which general approach is better. In my own field of political science, there was intense pushback against the dominance of quantitative approaches by the perestroika movement of the 2000s, which was named after the political call for restructuring in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. This revolt called for greater pluralism in the methods used to do research in political science as a discipline. So different disciplines focus on different approaches to research, and the nature of your project will often dictate what kind of research that you do. But all these approaches are simply different forms of inquiry, and that's the key point. Regardless of the type of research we choose, ultimately we are trying to explore, describe, understand, explain, evaluate, or predict something about the world. Because research is about inquiry, it's important to understand that we don't always find what we expect. Take Alexander Fleming, who in 1928 discovered penicillin while investigating bacteria, or William Henry Perkin, who in 1856 created the first artificial dye while trying to synthesize an anti-malarial drug. In fact, many of the most important discoveries in the world were found largely by accident. Some discoverers actually wind up regretting that they made their discoveries at all. Alfred Nobel, for whom many top prizes are named, including the Nobel Peace Prize, invented dynamite as a safer explosive for construction projects, never intending it would be used as a weapon of war. Albert Einstein's discoveries in physics set the foundation for the invention of the atomic bomb, and he expressed deep remorse over how his work was used. When we do research, we have to be open to both the unintended and the undesired. You can't go into a research project thinking you already know the answer and are only looking for information that confirms your pre-existing ideas. You have to be open to what you find, to what the data tells you, even if it means that your initial ideas are wrong. This is a fundamental principle of research and methods. We never set out to prove ourselves correct. If anything, our job is to try our hardest to disprove our ideas. Only if we subject our initial thoughts to the most rigorous of tests and they pass, can we have any confidence that our ideas might be right. If instead we set out to only find the information that confirms what we already believe, then we aren't doing research. We're just pushing a point of view or trying to make ourselves look good. Consider the position of the news media, which has sometimes been accused by politicians of producing fake news. The charge suggests that media organizations are making up stories or twisting facts to support particular narratives that they want to push. Fundamentally, such accusations assert that the media have an agenda and are inventing facts or reporting them selectively to make their opinions seem legitimate. If you're a reporter or a news organization, how can you combat an accusation of fake news? By providing evidence of method. If you can demonstrate how you acquired your information, that you did so systematically and according to the principles of research methods in your discipline, then you can refute the charge that you made things up or haphazardly gathered information. If you can't point to systematic, rigorous method, then the accusation might have some merit. In late 2017, the Washington Post preempted an accusation of fake news by following sound journalistic procedure. A woman named Jamie Phillips claimed to have been impregnated at the age of 15 by Alabama Senate hopeful Roy Moore, a state judge who had been accused of sexual misconduct by multiple other women during his campaign. Reporters at the Post followed standard procedure, looking into Phillips' background and trying to find corroborating evidence for her claims. Instead, they found holes in her story and discovered that she was secretly working for Project Veritas, an organization that tries to expose liberal bias in the news media. The Post had published several stories on Moore's misconduct, and so it could have assumed that this story too was true. Instead, the Post investigated Jamie Phillips' story on its own merits. The Post reporters followed their methods, engaged in systematic research, and uncovered the false nature of Phillips' claims. Fake news, pseudoscience, junk science, all of these are names for poorly done or unsystematic research. But they are also accusations that can be used to undermine confidence in legitimate, systematic, vital research, which makes it doubly important that anything you present to the world as a fact be researched carefully and thoroughly. It's so easy to do otherwise, especially in our hectic modern lives. And the truth is that many of us do that all the time without thinking about it. You do a quick internet search on something, find an article that supports what you believe, and then feeling more confident in that belief, you share it with others. But how did that article you found come to its conclusions? It's human nature to believe a study that confirms your existing beliefs, even if the study was poorly done. But this course is going to show you why the study that challenges your beliefs is the one that really deserves your attention. When you consider how many disciplines and areas of human endeavor depend on research, it's clear that there are tons of methods we could cover in this course. We're going to focus, however, on empirical research that uses the scientific method as a way to find answers to questions. Not all research is grounded in the scientific method, of course, but many of the principles of empirical scientific research apply to all kinds of questions and problems, from what brand of shampoo will give you the best results to why people vote the way they do. I think you'll find that the concepts, principles, and techniques we cover will aid you in your research no matter what area you want to explore. So let's talk about the scientific method of research. What we call the scientific method is a systematic approach to research that relies on observation, hypothesis formation, prediction, and hypothesis testing. Its origins can be traced back to Aristotle, but it has been refined over the centuries, most notably between the 16th and 18th centuries by luminaries such as Francis Bacon and Sir Isaac Newton, but in other important ways by scientists of the 20th and 21st century as our understanding of reality and the ability to observe it have developed. Debates on the method can range to the frontiers of philosophy and knowledge. In its essence, it is simply a process to follow that will get you from whatever research question you might have to an answer, regardless of your discipline, profession, or topic of study. I've already made a few disclaimers, but let me make some more. I'm going to give you a set of steps for the scientific method, which will also help structure the rest of this course. Keep in mind, though, that these steps should not be seen as a pure literal path to follow. In some cases, you might go to step 2 first and then go back to step 1. In others, it's a more cyclical process where different steps feed into each other and you go back and forth between them, and one project leads directly into the next. If you look up the scientific method online, you will actually find it described in many different ways. What I call step 3 might be 2 or 3 steps in another model, or missing entirely. But any version of the scientific method is itself an idealized approach that rests on the assumption that there is an objective reality for us to observe, something that no one has really managed to demonstrate. So don't idealize it even more by assuming that you have to follow each of these steps exactly and in strict order, or you're doing it wrong. Okay, with those caveats, here is the scientific method in 6 steps. Step number 1, ask a question. Now, that's not as obvious or as easy as it may sound. As we'll discuss in a future lecture, it's not enough to just have a topic of interest. Research relies on questions. Questions give us a focused reason for study, and so at some point early in the process, you need to figure out what yours might be. It might be, what kind of product is likely to sell big in this market? Or what kinds of mass violence are considered terrorism? Or why are cats better pets than dogs? Yes, as an owner of 3 cats, I may have a little bias on that last one. Step number 2 is observe. This means we have to start making observations about the world around us, both so that we understand the context for our question, but also so that we know what others have already discovered. It might be that your question has already been answered. It's only through reading what is already known, or as we call it, conducting a literature review, that you will find that out. Think back to when you were a kid and you had all kinds of questions about the world and how it worked. Why the seasons change, or why the sky is blue, or why you had to take that disgusting medicine. You asked the question and someone, a parent, another adult, or a book from the library, answered it. There was no need to conduct an experiment because others had already investigated these questions and found answers. There is excitement in moving beyond to ask new questions that nobody has answered before. But keep in mind that how we observe, the order and method that we follow, are of vital importance. Step number 3 is form a hypothesis. Now, not all research involves hypothesis testing. As we've discussed already, some research aims at exploration or description, in which case steps 1 and 2 might be sufficient. But if you are trying to explain cause and effect, then generating a hypothesis is key. For purposes of research, a hypothesis is defined as an educated guess of the answer to your question, grounded in the observations you've completed. It's typically a testable statement of the relationship between 2 or more concepts and clearly expresses how you anticipate that they are related or impact each other. So I might hypothesize that people who own cats are likely to be happier than those who own dogs. I'm basically saying that cat ownership and happiness are related, that there is a pattern to cat ownership and happiness. I can test this statement, if I want, by designing a study of some kind to see whether what I think to be true actually is. Depending on your study, you might be making predictions about behavior in this step that you can test. Or you might start developing a theory if something produces a certain outcome. For example, why having cats as pets might make people happy. Other times, you might not want to start predicting or theorizing until after you've completed your test or multiple tests and analyzed the results. That's the main difference between two other common classifications of research, deductive and inductive. Deductive research starts with theories and tests them, while inductive work starts with observation and then builds theories from the results. Remember how I warned you that you don't have to necessarily follow all these steps in the exact order I'm listing them? I meant what I said. Let's move on. Step 4 is test your hypothesis. Now, this is the meat of research methods. In this step, you first have to design a good study to see whether your hypothesis holds water and then carry it out. That means choosing your methodology, figuring out how to measure your concepts and variables, identifying a relevant population and sample, going out and gathering your data, and perhaps applying for funding so that you have the resources to do all of this. We will spend many lectures covering each of these sub-steps. For now, the point is that the scientific method of research won't allow you simply to state your hypothesis and consider yourself done. And you can't just report on the data you find that supports your initial hypothesis and say that you're done either. Instead, you have to set out to rigorously test your hypothesis, considering and evaluating any alternative hypotheses and explanations. Only if your hypothesis survives the testing process can you report with any confidence, although, of course, usually with still some level of uncertainty, that your initial ideas might have had some merit. Step number 5 is analyze your results. So once you've finished testing your hypothesis, it's time to analyze the data you gathered and interpret it. Does it support or refute your hypothesis? Pay careful attention to data that contradicts your initial views. You might need to revise your hypothesis or theory or develop entirely new ideas. This is also where you want to consider the implications of your results, particularly for applied research purposes. It's at this stage that you figure out if you've actually found an answer to your question or if more work needs to be done. Typically, this is also where you discover the next 3 or 5 or 8 questions you want to answer now that you've embedded yourself in this work. So this leads us to our final step. Step number 6, communicate your results. Research is all about communication. Sure, if you want, you can keep your findings to yourself, and if they didn't turn out as you expected, you might be tempted to do that. In fact, it's possible that many great questions about the world have already been answered, but the finders chose to keep their results to themselves. All I can think of is what a loss that is. I'm a big fan of the early 19th century English writer Jane Austen, and many questions that I have about her life and her writing might have been answered in the letters that she exchanged with her sister Cassandra, letters that were burned after Austen's death. Cassandra probably knew those answers, but the rest of the world never will. So I encourage you to share. Sharing your findings is an essential part of the research process for 3 reasons. First, it allows your work to undergo peer review. Whether that's a formal process with a publisher or not, it means that you're making your findings available for others to read, evaluate, and replicate. You may think that your conclusions are unshakable, but only if others studying the same thing agree can you really be sure. This can happen throughout the entire process. Mentors and peers can be super helpful in checking your work as you go along. But it's still essential at the end so you can have confidence in your results. The ability to evaluate and replicate your work is what allows the world to put faith in your findings. The second reason to share your work is that it might have a positive impact on others. There may be others who are asking similar questions who will benefit from seeing your answer. Those might be fellow researchers or practitioners in your field. The ivory tower of academia is often criticized for doing basic research with few practical applications, and part of that criticism is that academics don't know how to effectively communicate with policymakers and practitioners. Whether that's fair or not, you can be an effective communicator. The advent of social media and other forms of free mass communication means you can reach large audiences with your work if you want to. Let me issue a caveat there, though. If your work could be used by others to harm, as with some of my earlier examples of work that had socially undesirable effects, you might want to think through the ethical implications of sharing. And of course, you probably don't want to share findings that might benefit a competitor. If you found the secret to the stock market, for example, you might want to be discreet in whom you share that with. Maybe just me? The final reason to communicate your results, of course, is just to get simple recognition for the hard work of doing research. Your work might not be picked up by scholars and published in a journal or change public policy, but it still represents a solid product that is the result of hard work, and that should be celebrated for its own sake. Watch your words, though. Your impulse may be to crow about your results and the accuracy of your initial theory, but as many a prominent scientist has learned the hard way, that's a mistake well worth avoiding. In research, it's always better to be clear about your uncertainty and to be honest and careful about the extent of your claims. If you overstate your findings, your work won't be as valued as if you report it factually, and it may be disregarded altogether. Research can be very humbling work. So, who should be using research methods? The answer is you, everyone. Research methods aren't only for students in the classroom or researchers working in labs or universities. The systematic process of gathering and evaluating information is useful in your everyday life, from figuring out where you should eat breakfast this weekend to which car you should purchase. With a little bit of training, everyone can do research, regardless of your math or science skills. You just need some basic principles and procedures, which we will cover in the rest of this course, and a little bit of mentorship that I will try to provide. If you follow the steps I will lay out for you, your research really could one day change the world, or at least your corner of it. Late in the summer of 2017, powerful hurricanes churned across the Atlantic Ocean. Hurricane Katia would go on to hit the eastern Mexican coast. Jose spun in circles before threatening the northeastern United States. Irma destroyed several islands in the Caribbean before taking aim at Florida's west coast, followed swiftly by Maria, which caused widespread destruction in Puerto Rico. All of this followed Hurricane Harvey, which rained down destruction and intense floods in Texas. Bad as the impact of these storms was, though, it could have been much worse. Even though storm forecasting and modeling were unable to completely prevent loss of life or property, the damage was significantly reduced because people had advance warning of the hurricane's arrival, and critically, they believed the weather reports and warnings to be true. Why do people believe such reports, especially given that forecasts are often wrong? Well, modern storm forecasting is grounded in scientific research. It's systematic, with well-established and calibrated models set up to predict the path of a given storm. Storm forecasters are also objective. They have little to gain and a lot to lose from making false predictions, so they have no incentive to bias their results in one direction or another. Their work is grounded in observable data, it's publicly available, and it relies on the work completed by other forecasters, past and present. There is a high level of uncertainty in what they do, of course, but because there is widely shared faith that the research that leads to their predictions is sound, when the forecasters predict a severe storm, people take action. Governors declare states of emergency, people board up their houses or evacuate, and relief agencies get ready. Let's consider a related issue where trust in researchers is not so easily given. One enormous topic of debate in the United States in the early 21st century has been climate change. The potential effects of an increase in average global temperatures, such as rising sea levels and, yes, more intense storm activity, is a mainstay in discussions about public policy. So are the different responses a city or a country can have to a changing climate. What is fascinating is the disagreement over whether that shift in temperatures is even happening at all. You may have heard the statement that 97% of scientists agree that climate change is a real man-made problem. And yet, according to a 2016 report from the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, only 70% of Americans believe that climate change is happening, and only 53% believe it is due to man-made causes. Even more interesting, despite that 97% number, 28% of Americans believe there is a lot of disagreement between scientists on this subject, and 26% either somewhat or strongly distrust climate scientists about global warming. So how can we tell for ourselves whether climate scientists should be trusted? Ironically, the distrust of climate research and the perceived disagreement amongst climate scientists occurs in part as a result of trusting others to evaluate information for us. For example, maybe you are watching the Sunday morning talk shows on cable news and there's a discussion on climate change. It's pretty typical for such a debate to feature one person basing their position on the idea that climate change is real and man-made, and another who is skeptical. That creates the impression that the divide is 50-50, even if it's really 97-3. Now, John Oliver, host of Last Week Tonight, memorably lampooned this habit by holding a statistically representative climate change debate, featuring Bill Nye the Science Guy and 96 other scientists facing off against just 3 climate skeptics. But there's no way to evaluate research properly. To do that, we have to evaluate the research findings and the claims they make about how the world works for ourselves. And to do that, we need to establish some criteria for good research, so we know what to look for when reading the works of others. Identifying those criteria will also help us know how to structure our own research to ensure that it too is of the highest quality. We're going to call these criteria the 5 key characteristics of good research. While there are certainly other characteristics of good research as well, the following 5 will give us a good start to understanding the fundamentals of how to approach a research project. The first key characteristic of good research is that it should follow a systematic method. By systematic, I mean that research follows a set of sound procedures in the process of discovery and finding answers. Now, all of us have done research at various points in our life. Perhaps you've researched the best school for your children or a great bargain hotel for your next vacation. What was your process for doing that research? Maybe you Googled great hotels in London. If you do, you will get about 100 million results to sort through, and that's not very practical. It's also not a systematic approach to your task. You might instead start with a list of criteria for what you consider to be a great hotel. You might take into account factors like location, price, decor, and amenities such as on-site dining, spas, pools, gyms, or business centers. Then there are reviews, awards, and ratings to consider. Now, this is just your personal vacation. You don't necessarily have to figure all of this out in advance before you do your first search. You could just pick a place that sounds good. But what if you need to justify your choice to friends or family that are also going on the trip? What if you were a travel agent tasked with finding a list of hotels for a client? You'll need a better process in place than a simple Google search, one that you can justify to someone else. Let's think about the term research methods for a second. The second word, methods, is defined by Merriam-Webster's dictionary as, quote, a systematic procedure, technique, or mode of inquiry, end quote. Proper research then has to have systematic procedures for a researcher to follow. You can't deviate from those procedures due to boredom or because you aren't getting the answers you want. That's a surefire way to come up with incorrect or biased results. For example, let's pretend we are travel agents and our clients have asked us to find them a cheap hotel in central London that has a spa. We do our Google search and find a few options, and we send the listing for the cheapest of those hotels to the client who books it. But then the next day, you get an email from the client who's found an option you missed. She made a list of every hotel in a 2-mile radius from Buckingham Palace, used their online sites to determine which ones had spas, and then checked the prices. Her process produced much richer and more accurate results, and lost you a client. Systematic research, in short, keeps us honest, and it ensures that we can stand behind the results we come up with. By using sound methods, we can demonstrate that our findings aren't due to our personal preferences or laziness, but due to following a set, defendable process. So how do you make your research systematic? Well, it starts by following the scientific method and ensuring that you have a solid research design. That research design will lay out the specific procedures you will be following in your work, such as an experiment, survey, case study, or analysis of an existing database. In this course, I'm going to give you a wide variety of options on how to set up your research. Your task is to ensure that you establish your procedures accordingly and follow them. Correspondingly, when you evaluate the work of someone else, you should look for a clearly outlined methodology section in their writing or presentation. That methodology section is where a researcher explains the process they followed to get to their results. If there's no discussion of the methodology, or if it seems very haphazard, then this is a sign that the research wasn't conducted systematically and probably doesn't deserve your trust. That requirement to be systematic should be comforting. Consider that when people want to reassure others that they're not crazy, they often paraphrase Shakespeare by saying, "There's method in my madness." Research can be a maddening process, but knowing we have systematic method to what we do is a big help. The second key characteristic of good research is objectivity. Researchers must be neutral towards their study and remain objective throughout the research process. If you start out wanting to prove yourself correct, or sure that a certain point of view is better than another, you're setting yourself up for biased results, and in turn, poorly conducted research. Everyone is entitled to their opinion, but research isn't about opinions. Sometimes we get results we don't like. We have to be open to that. The reason is that research can be seen as a quest for truth. To the extent that an objective truth exists, a highly debatable prospect itself, that is what we seek. We're looking to find out the answer to a research question by observing the world around us. It's fine to start out with a guess as to what that answer is, but you must be open to the idea that your guess is wrong. In fact, one kind of research known as hypothesis testing aims at vigorously testing hypotheses in an attempt to prove them wrong. If you challenge your guess at every turn and it still holds up, then you can have some level of confidence that it might be correct. But if you go in with an idea of an answer and then either subject it to weak tests or, worse, look for evidence proving it correct, you're not conducting research. You're cherry-picking data to support your biases or to make yourself look good, and that is not good research. So our quest is not to prove our ideas right, but to figure out answers to questions about how the world works. Only by aiming for objectivity can we achieve this. Let's return to our travel agent example. Imagine that you really love the Four Seasons Hotel in London. Your client tasks you the same as before. Find the cheapest hotel with a spa. You do a search, but you push the Four Seasons on her. It's not the cheapest, but you talk up its other amenities to try to convince her. Sensing your bias, she ends up going with another agent who's more honest about the variety of options in central London. Your work can't be trusted because it's driven by subjective preferences rather than objective results. You wouldn't hesitate to evaluate the research of others in the same way. It's the smart thing to do. You should pay attention to any conflicts of interest that researchers might have. If they're affiliated with a think tank or company or other agent, consider what impact that might have on their work. Their jobs and income might depend on producing a certain set of results, and this should be suspect. Now, they certainly can still produce objective work, but you need to know about their potential biases so you can judge for yourself. The researcher should disclose any potential conflicts of interest so you can evaluate their methods and results with this in mind. Another thing to look for is charged language. If the language in someone's work relies on non-neutral descriptive terms, that may be evidence of bias and the lack of objectivity. For example, let's say you've hired a travel agent and she has sent you a list of potential hotels. The Four Seasons is described as the exceptionally beautiful Four Seasons Hotel with its superb location and dramatic but tasteful spa. Meanwhile, another hotel is described as neutral decor, central location, and has a spa. The superlatives for that first hotel are clearly designed to advocate for it, while the neutral terminology for the second hotel stands in complete contrast. Such descriptions aren't about presenting options for the client to choose from, they're about advocating for a specific decision. For your own work, be honest with yourself. If you have a preference towards finding a particular answer or result, will you be willing to admit it if you turn out to be wrong? If the answer is no, this might not be the best project for you. Starting out by trying to prove your idea is correct is probably going to lead to results that no one will trust. So it's best to focus on a question or project of great interest to you, but where you're neutral towards the eventual findings or answer. The third key characteristic of good research is that it is empirical. By empirical, we mean that our evidence is grounded in observations and data. Research, fundamentally, is based on what we can observe in the world, not what we hope or wish to be true about the world. Our findings and conclusions must be based on an analysis of data that, to the greatest extent possible, represents an objective observation of the world around us. Now, this isn't always easy. Some things we might want to observe, we simply can't. We can't travel back in time, for example, to witness the signing of Magna Carta or the building of the pyramids. Other times, human or technological failings prevent us from getting completely accurate observations. Instruments can fail, camera angles can be off, and human memory can be faulty or limited in perspective. The point here is that research requires acknowledging and wrestling these limitations to acquire accurate observations about the world that we can then analyze. Now, this doesn't mean that our results will necessarily be consistent or that they will yield clear answers to our questions. There is often a high degree of uncertainty and ambiguity in what we do. In some fields, such as chemistry, you can be reasonably sure that if you follow the same exact procedures under the same exact conditions again and again, you will get the same results. In other fields, such as the social sciences, the story is much different. Ask a person to repeat the same task under the same conditions over and over, and they may change things up out of boredom or a mischievous spirit. Chemicals, I'm told, don't get bored. Many of the things we study, therefore, are going to turn out in a way that we can't predict with any precision, at least some percentage of the time. As an example, let's consider storm forecasting again. There are so many factors involved in predicting the path of a storm. This is why hurricane forecasts depict the possible paths in the form of a cone. The cone represents the dozens of different paths that the hurricane might take while still narrowing them down to provide helpful information on the storm's general direction. So take Hurricane Irma. 4 days before the storm hit Florida in early September 2017, the news media's focus was on the heavily populated cities of Miami and Fort Lauderdale on the state's East Coast. The storm ended up going up the West Coast instead. But both coasts had been within forecasters' cone of possible landfall, and the East Coast still experienced extensive storm surge and winds, so the preparations that people there made in response to the news reports weren't for nothing. Just because the data can't give us a definitive 100% foolproof answer doesn't mean that the research isn't accurate or useful. The fourth key characteristic of good research is that it is cumulative. It builds on what other researchers have already discovered, and it helps build a scientific consensus. Look, research, it's an incremental process. We tend to want to answer the big questions entirely by ourselves. But to do research well, we usually need to start small and work collaboratively with other experts. You can think of research in any particular area as a giant jigsaw puzzle. Each research project is one puzzle piece, and the large puzzle itself, once complete, will show us the big answers to our questions about the world. If you don't know what other pieces are out there, you won't know where to put yours. And we can put the puzzle together much faster if lots of people are working on it at once, confirming that the pieces do in fact fit together as each person thought. Well, that does depend. I know some people who are terrible at putting together puzzles. The metaphor only gets us so far. Our point is that research requires us to assess, critique, and build on previous work. As we'll discuss separately in greater detail, if you don't acknowledge and build on earlier findings, your work won't be taken seriously. It is fine to critique or reject the work that has come before, but you still need to know it so that your audience knows how to situate your work with the other research they've read. And it's only by replicating and confirming previously published work that we can really come to a consensus about how the world works. A single study is not enough. Remember earlier when we talked about how 97% of climate scientists argue that climate change is real and man-made? One of the grounds for that claim is a 2013 study of peer-reviewed articles that took a position on global warming. The study evaluated the abstracts of almost 12,000 articles written by 29,000 authors and published in 1,980 journals. Of those that took a position on anthropogenic global warming, 97.1% endorsed the scientific consensus. This is part of what we mean by cumulative work. A single paper study claiming that global warming or climate change is real and man-made wouldn't necessarily convince anyone to take action on such a complex global issue. But knowing that 12,000 articles claim this, that is a much more persuasive claim. Our fifth and final key characteristic of good research is transparency. We need to be open and transparent about all aspects of our research. The systematic methods we follow, any conflicts of interest, the empirical nature of our data, and how the work builds on and relates to other findings. Typically, this entails writing up our specific methodology and making our data available to others. This lets other researchers replicate our results. They can take our data, follow our procedures, and should be able to come up with the same findings that we did. This keeps us honest as researchers and lets others have more confidence in our work. Consider the story of Michael LaCour. In 2014, LaCour was a graduate student in political science at UCLA, and he published an article in the journal Science. The article was entitled, quote, "When Contact Changes Minds, an experiment on transmission of support for gay equality," end quote. And it was co-authored with Columbia University's Dr. Donald Green. This article challenged conventional wisdom on the subject of political canvassing. Previous research had questioned whether going door to door and talking to voters about an issue made any long-term difference in their political beliefs. The study by LaCour and Green challenged that. It found that when gay canvassers talked with voters, the voters' beliefs tended to change, and those changes persisted through follow-ups with the same voters weeks and months later. The study was widely covered in the media and influenced policy and practice on this issue. LaCour was touted as an upcoming star in the field, and he received an offer of a position as an assistant professor at Princeton University. So all was going well for LaCour until May 19, 2015, when several of LaCour's graduate student colleagues published a challenge to this study. The data, they said, was falsified. In their efforts to replicate the study, they found no evidence to suggest that the data reported by LaCour and Green had ever actually been collected in the first place. The scandal rocked the political science world, with accusations flying left and right over how much of the study might be fabricated, whether Green was really aware of what work Michael LaCour had done and hadn't done, and why the study's findings had been so widely publicized in the first place. The journal Science retracted the article, and LaCour lost his position at Princeton. Transparency ensures that research can be vetted before, during, and after publication. The LaCour case shows why this is absolutely vital. The norm of transparency ensures that research, which is often the basis for our society's most important decisions, is based on genuine, accurate, and ethical work, even if it sometimes takes a while to root out work that fails to live up to that standard. The transparency of research to other researchers is vital, but increasingly, scientists and researchers are also trying to make their research more transparent to the public. Most academic papers contain all kinds of jargon that can only be deciphered by those with a PhD, and the right PhD at that. Academics and scientists generally aren't trained to write for outside audiences, which is why they often get accused of occupying an ivory tower, isolated from the general public and only talking to themselves. And when others try to communicate their work for them, the nuances can get lost in translation. This particular problem is captured in a cartoon about the science news cycle from Piled Higher and Deeper, an online comic series about graduate school. In it, a scientist publishes a finding that's quite limited in its scope. It's a correlation that only exists under certain conditions and parameters, and even then, it is not 100% certain. By the time his publication makes its way through PR offices, news stations, and social media, though, all of its careful nuance is gone, and whatever the scientist discovered, it is 100% guaranteed to kill you. And yet, as illustrated by the policy debates surrounding global warming, researchers have to think about how to communicate their findings, not only to their peers, but to all interested and affected parties. True transparency requires that. So, those are the 5 key characteristics of good research. Again, there are other important qualities of sound research as well. What's expected may vary depending on your field, project, or methodology. But the characteristics that we've just considered can be reasonably applied to most fields. Let's return now to a question that I touched on earlier and take a more thorough look at it. How can you determine whether research has been done well or not? Well, here are some pointers. First, make sure that the author has consistently and accurately cited his sources of evidence. If the study attributes an asserted fact to what some people say, but provides no quotations or citations, the author might be making an assumption rather than reporting a general finding. If the author refers to a study or an expert's opinion, there should be some kind of citation, even just a website or link that lets you read the original source. Good researchers check their sources and cite originals, so if the citation record is spotty, you should question the work. Another thing to consider is the reliability of the author's sources of evidence. Whoever wrote the study that the author is citing might have invented the information, creating what is now often called fake news. You may have to check the original source's citations to make sure they themselves are accurate. Make sure these studies aren't being misrepresented. It's easy to choose a chart, graph, or statistic from a larger study and manipulate it to tell the story you want to tell. If the original source is a personal blog, an opinion page in a newspaper, or some other form of commentary, then it may be unreliable. There may not be checks on that source to ensure its accuracy or objectivity. Be sure to watch out for any signs of ideological or other bias, and keep in mind that crowdsourced sites like Wikipedia are also problematic. They may attempt to achieve objectivity by making themselves open to public scrutiny, but the information they provide is easily manipulated and may or may not be policed vigilantly. Third, evaluate the nature of any experts that the author relies on. Who are these experts? Do they have credentials in the specific topic at hand? On the subject of climate change, that 97% figure that I mentioned earlier represented the percentage of scientists who agree that climate change is a real man-made problem. But who qualified as a scientist? As it turns out, only climate scientists who actively published on climate change made the cut. As you can imagine, though, if you did a survey of all scientists in any field, the number that believe in man-made climate change would drop. Whom you count as an expert matters in terms of the results you get. When you're judging the merits of research, be especially wary of findings based on personal experience. We all tend to use our own personal experience or that of people around us as evidence for some greater phenomenon. It might be, my parents spanked me and I grew up just fine, or everyone I know who drives a foreign car regrets it. These may indeed be your experiences, but that doesn't mean they are in any way representative on the whole of the outcomes experienced by the general population when it comes to spanking or owning a foreign car. We'll discuss this issue too in more detail later in the course, but I want to bring it to your attention now, given how easy it is to fall into the trap of relying on what you yourself have experienced and therefore think you know with certainty. Personal experience can illustrate a phenomenon, but by itself, it's not evidence to be used in research. If you see a study that relies on just a few first-person experiences to justify a finding, watch out. Finally, check the author's research to see how fairly it treats alternative claims and findings. Does it conduct a rigorous test of those claims? Does the presentation leave room for the possibility that the author may be wrong? Or does the data seem cherry-picked to support a single conclusion? Strong research should give alternative arguments a fair shot and acknowledge the limitations and nuances of the author's findings and claims. People love everything to be binary, black and white, good and evil, good and bad research. But that isn't how the world works. We live in a world of nuance and subtlety, where every observation has qualifications and exceptions. If you see words like always and never, or other language that consistently ignores nuances and presents findings in binary terms rather than as points along a possible continuum, you should be suspicious. To return one last time to the example of our travel agent, you should be looking to see that she provides you with a complete list of pros and cons for each hotel. The trade-offs are what assure you that she fairly considered all of the options, not just the ones that she recommends. Okay, today we have covered a lot. We identified 5 key characteristics of good research. Good research is systematic, objective, empirical, cumulative, and transparent. We also discussed how to evaluate research so that we can effectively assess the research we read and avoid making mistakes when doing it ourselves. Now you're well equipped to start thinking about research from a big picture perspective, something that is absolutely vital before you get started on your own project. In the early 2000s, Wang Woo-suk, a professor at Seoul National University, was renowned for his work in stem cell research. He published 2 articles in the journal Science and was celebrated internationally for having cloned embryonic stem cells. Some considered him a national hero in South Korea. Turns out he allegedly fabricated his data and also coercively obtained the eggs for his studies. Many of the women didn't provide their fully informed consent to use their eggs, and 2 of them were researchers on his own team under pressure to cooperate. In 2009, he was convicted of embezzlement, he was fired, and he had his 2 papers retracted. Wang Woo-suk's work certainly stands out as an example of unethical research, but alas, his case was by no means unprecedented. In 1999, Jesse Gelsinger, a man suffering from a genetic metabolic disease, died while undergoing a scientific study into the effects of gene therapy at the University of Pennsylvania. A report alleged that the directors of the study included Gelsinger in their study even though he didn't meet their health requirements, and they failed to report some of the harmful effects of the treatment they were testing that had already been seen in previous stages. Gelsinger, too, can be considered a victim of unethical research. In 1972, news media reported on a 40-year study at Tuskegee University, then Tuskegee Institute, in Alabama. In collaboration with the U.S. Public Health Service, investigators conducted studies on the effects of syphilis in African American men. The researchers didn't tell their subjects that they had syphilis, nor did they give them the penicillin treatments that would have helped them. Many passed on the disease unknowingly to spouses and children. Many died of syphilis. All of them suffered due to this unethical research practice. During World War II, the Nazis engaged in extensive experimentation on prisoners in concentration camps. They exposed people to frigid temperatures to check the effects of hypothermia. They used toxic gases and chemicals on prisoners to test different treatments for chemical burns. They also forcibly sterilized people to identify the most effective techniques to control people's abilities to procreate. And I could go on. We are talking about the Nazis, after all, and to list all of their research wrongs would take up this entire lecture. Research ethics are the codes, norms, and principles of accepted behavior for those who conduct research. As you can see from the examples I've just given, ethical principles did not exactly inform or inhibit the actions of many researchers in the 20th century. Our task in research is to uncover new ideas and information, but at the same time, we are charged with making sure that the benefits of that new information outweigh the costs, and that we do everything possible to ensure no one is harmed in the course of our research. It also means that we engage in honesty about our work, that we are clear about which ideas are ours and which are borrowed, and that we report the truth of the outcomes of our work and not what we want to be true. Journalists, for example, have certain ethics that they follow in the course of their work. For example, when they agree to a source remaining anonymous, they have to protect that anonymity, just as researchers typically have to keep the identity of our subjects anonymous. Like us, they are tasked with limiting harm, which is one reason they are particularly sensitive to the privacy of minors when describing events in their reports. Also, like us, there is an intent to be objective and neutral in how they approach their work, and to seek out truth rather than proving their own ideas correct. They can't make up facts to fit the story they want to tell. They have to find corroborating information from multiple sources to ensure they are telling a complete and accurate story. What I'm saying is that journalists are researchers. They are us. As you can probably imagine, the unethical studies of the early and mid-20th century led to some changes in how research ethics were viewed. Prior to World War II, there were very few federal regulations in the United States or widespread international principles regarding ethical research. The revelations of the Nazi experiments led to the first such set of regulations, the Nuremberg Code. These are 10 principles of human subject research. To summarize, they are: 1. Subjects must give their voluntary consent to participate in research. 2. Research should be for the benefit of society and not achievable through other means. 3. Experiments should be designed based on existing knowledge such that the anticipated results will justify the experiment. 4. Research should avoid unnecessary suffering and harm. 5. Do not do any research where it is known beforehand that death or disabling injury is likely, except perhaps if the experimenter is also the subject. 6. Risk should never exceed the humanitarian importance of the problem being investigated. 7. Preparation and proper facilities should aim at protecting subjects from even the remote chance of harm. 8. Only scientifically qualified persons should conduct experiments, and only with the highest degree of care. 9. Subjects should be able to end the experiment if they feel they cannot continue. And 10. The researcher must be prepared to terminate the experiment if they have reason to believe continuation will cause harm to the subject. These 10 principles, as we'll see, laid the groundwork for the protections to come. But as we saw from the earlier examples, ethical violations didn't stop in 1947. In 1964, the World Medical Association adopted the Declaration of Helsinki to establish principles of medical research. This document has been amended numerous times and includes many of the same principles of ethics. It states that, quote, while the primary purpose of medical research is to generate new knowledge, this goal can never take precedence over the rights and interests of individual research subjects, end quote. In the United States, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments led to the National Research Act of 1974, which established the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. The commission, commissioned the Belmont Report to, quote, identify the basic ethical principles, end quote, for the conduct of human subjects research. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services adopted the report's ideas as the common rule, the ethical principles regulating U.S. research on human subjects. The Belmont Report was issued in 1979 by the Commission. It is named after the Smithsonian Institution's Belmont Conference Center, where the initial discussions took place. It identifies 3 comprehensive principles of ethical research on human subjects. The first principle is respect for persons. This means recognizing that individuals are autonomous agents and that they have the ability to decide for themselves whether to participate in a research project. It also means that those who might not be able to act completely autonomously, children or those with, as the report put it, quote unquote, diminished capacity, require special protection. How much protection is required will depend on the person and the potential harm of the study, but should be determined with regard to this principle of respect. The second principle is beneficence. This word is ultimately derived from the Latin word beneficus. Bene means good or well, and ficus means doing. Beneficence then means doing good. Like the Hippocratic Oath, this principle requires that researchers do no harm. Subjects must be protected from unnecessary risks of harm, including physical, mental, psychological, social, economic, and legal harms. Additionally, beneficence requires that research maximize the general benefits to society and minimize harms to individual subjects. The third principle is justice. This final principle recognizes the long history of research that used the poor and disadvantaged for subjects, exposing them to harm while doing work that would ultimately benefit the wealthy or advantaged. Justice then calls for fairness in terms of access to research and its benefits and an equitable distribution of the potential risks to individuals. Drawing on these 3 principles, the Belmont Report generated a set of applications that would become required of researchers. First, researchers must solicit informed consent of their potential subjects. This means a few things. Subjects must be given enough information about the project's purposes, procedures, risks, and benefits to make an informed decision about whether they want to participate. This information must be distributed in such a way that the potential subjects can genuinely understand what their participation entails. So their consent to participate must be grounded in a complete understanding of what they will be asked to do, why the research is going ahead, why they are a potential subject, and the risks and benefits of participation to them and the larger society. Those unable to provide consent may be able to do so if a third party is able to act in that person's best interest and potentially provide informed consent on their behalf. Now, sometimes you might not want your subjects to know everything about your study before you start. In one 2010 study of racial bias, researchers found that the skin color of a person offering an iPod for sale online mattered in terms of how many people expressed interest in buying it. Suppose that as a researcher, you told your respondents up front that this is what you were studying. You could imagine that this might have some influence on how they respond in your experiment. Deception, then, is sometimes necessary for our research to work. The Belmont Report says that when deception is needed for the research to be valid, the subjects still need to know of any potential risks, if the deception poses additional risks that can't be withheld from them. Withholding information about the risks means they cannot make an informed decision to consent to participate. You also must debrief the participants at some point and tell them about the deception. Essentially, informed consent is about making sure that subject participation is genuinely voluntary. Participants must be able to choose to be involved, and they also must be free to withdraw that participation at any time without facing consequences for doing so. You can't coerce someone into participating, as Wang was accused of in his acquisition of eggs for his stem cell research. You also can't offer excessive compensation such that someone would feel like they can't really turn it down. And as always, special consideration must be given to vulnerable populations. Another application has to do with the assessment of risks and benefits. The proposed research must be justifiable as maximizing societal benefits and minimizing risks. That is, there must be value to society for the research. You can't experiment on people purely to satisfy your own curiosity or to gain personal benefit. All kinds of harm need to be considered, not just physical harm, but psychological, mental, legal, economic, social, and reputational harms. So this entails protecting the identities of your subjects and even keeping the fact that they participated in your study confidential. You may need to have procedures for securing your data, particularly if it contains identifying information. For example, when I do interviews in my own research, I don't use names in the recordings, and any names that my subject use are changed in the transcriptions. The original recordings are in password-protected digital files and are typically destroyed following transcription. The only documents that have names are the informed consent forms that my subjects fill out, and those are kept under lock and key. I do this even though it's unlikely that exposure of their participation or identity would cause any harm, but there's no reason for even the slightest risk. Now, obviously, if your research does pose a risk or is on vulnerable populations, then you have to be extra cautious. Imagine you want to do research on LGBTQ+ rights in a country where it's illegal to engage in same-sex relationships. Those subjects would face serious legal and physical risks if you fail to conceal their participation or identities. The final application concerns the selection of subjects. Quite simply, there must be fair procedures and equitable outcomes in how subjects are selected for research. You can't offer the benefits of your research to particular people or groups and deny them to others on the basis of personal preference. That repeats the mistakes of the past when the groups suffering the risks of research receive none of the benefits. Consider again the African American men in the Tuskegee study on syphilis. They suffered great risks, but saw limited direct benefits from the research. Justice requires that if certain populations are overly burdened and the research you wish to do could pose additional harm in those areas, then less burdened populations should be called upon first as subjects for the research. And as always, vulnerable populations deserve special attention and should only be included in the research if their participation is absolutely necessary for the study's success. The Belmont Report is an important milestone in the establishment of ethical principles for research in the United States, and its principles should inform our practice as we move forward with designing our own studies. But keep in mind that the Belmont Report and the government's common rule apply to the United States only. Research outside the US may have different rules, so if your research is international, you need to consider the rules in your host country, as well as the potential benefits and harms that might be unique to that local population. There is actually a long history of exploiting international differences in ethical procedures for research. For example, in the 1990s, some researchers sponsored by the National Institutes of Health wanted to do a study on a whooping cough vaccine. They wanted to include a placebo group in the study. That means some children in the study would not receive any actual medical treatment, even though they'd be at a higher risk of contracting the disease due to participating in the study. US rules would not have allowed this study. So it was done instead in Italy and Sweden, where the regulations regarding placebos were less strict. In both countries, the study passed ethical review boards. Later, in 2000, the Declaration of Helsinki recommended stricter regulations on the use of placebos, but other international guidelines remain more permissive. Many US-based pharmaceutical companies have moved their clinical studies overseas because it's cheaper and easier to find participants. And while they're still supposed to comply with US laws, that doesn't always happen. It's not always clear if every regulation applies if it differs with the law in another country. And in some cases, the rules may represent a culture clash. The rule about informed consent, for example, requires that an individual make the decision about participating in a study. This Western focus on individualism may cause issues in areas where decisions are more family or community-based. And if participants are flocking to studies because this is their only way to access medical care for an illness or condition, then their participation should not, strictly speaking, be considered truly voluntary. Finally, keep in mind that just because some practices are permitted by law, that doesn't mean they are ethical. Businesses frequently do product testing overseas where there are fewer legal restrictions on such practices. But that doesn't mean the behavior is ethical. Legal and ethical are not the same thing. Here's the key point. Follow the principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, regardless of where you conduct your research. But realize that those principles may entail additional protections depending on where you are. So far, we've been talking mostly about ethics of how to protect your subjects in research, but there are other ethical practices we have to consider. How to behave ethically as a researcher, regardless of the type of research that you do. Even if you never talk to another human being in the course of your research, maybe you study medieval history, for example, and live in the archives with books and manuscripts, you still have to consider your own behavior and ethics. The principles I'm about to discuss will seem pretty basic and self-explanatory, but it's still worthwhile to review them. First, don't make up data. Falsifying or distorting data to make your results look better or support a story you want to tell is an incredible ethical violation. Don't put your personal gain above those you study. Remember, our task is to advance the state of knowledge in the world. There can be some personal benefits to doing that, but those should be secondary. One way to avoid this is to craft your studies so that no matter what the data show, you have something interesting to say. This will limit the temptation to fabricate results. Second, if you have any conflicts of interest or reasons for bias, disclose them. We've already learned about the importance of aspiring for neutrality and objectivity in our research, but let's be fair. It can be difficult, if not completely impossible, to be completely neutral and objective in research. You have to be open to being wrong and discovering things that are not what you hoped. But you also have to be honest about any commitments in your life that might prevent you from being fully objective. If you're being paid by someone to do your research and they have a stake in the outcome, disclose that. Always acknowledge any sources of funding for your work so that your audience can make their own determination about whether that might cause bias in the work. Finally, be sure to properly attribute and protect the intellectual property of others. If you use any words, or maybe even more importantly, ideas of another researcher, you have to give that person proper credit. Cite thoroughly and often. You never want your reader to have to guess which ideas are yours and which you borrowed. My advice is take clear notes as you read through anyone's work. As you read, use symbols or highlighters or some other kind of system to note key claims or ideas of the author. Then use another symbol. I like to put the giant letters M and E, me, to indicate what ideas you have while reading that person's work. Then you know from your own notes which ideas are yours and which ones aren't. Regardless of the system you use, be clear in your own head about your contributions and make sure you properly give credit to others. That also means that if someone substantially helps you in your own work, you should consider whether they would properly be considered a co-author on the study. We discussed a number of basic principles to follow regarding ethical behavior in research. It's always important to keep them in mind, but depending on the kind of research you plan to do, there may be others whose job is to make sure you follow them. Most significantly, research in the United States on humans that is conducted by the government or any entity that receives government funding, directly or indirectly, must be approved by an independent ethical review board. These are usually called institutional review boards or IRBs. Their job is to make sure that the research you want to do follows the principles of the Belmont Report. In 1981, U.S. federal agencies started requiring IRBs to engage in oversight of research. IRBs can be based in universities or other institutes of research, or they can be independent or focused on commercial research. All must be registered with the federal government. Federal regulations require that these bodies have at least 5 members, with attention paid to diversity in the demographics and expertise of those members, and that at least one person is not affiliated with the institution housing the IRB. IRBs are not restricted to the US, however. They're found all over the world, although the specific regulations may differ by country. So here's the key. If you want to do any research on human subjects and your work is in any way funded by the US government, you must have IRB approval before you start your research. That means if you're a student at a university, you need IRB approval. If your organization receives grants from the US, you also need IRB approval. If your company wants to get approval from an accrediting agency or US government agency, you need IRB approval. Now, not every researcher necessarily needs IRB approval. If you're doing a personal project for a local organization and want to conduct a survey of your membership, you probably don't have to get IRB approval first. But that doesn't mean you're free to violate the principles of the Belmont Report. Always take care to protect the rights of your subjects, even if you don't have to get permission first. Some categories of research are actually exempt from IRB approval. These include some educational research, research involving publicly or anonymously available records, and research evaluating public programs, as well as a few other areas that are deemed to be very low risk. However, you don't get to decide that your research is exempt. Unless you're doing research that obviously needs no approval, such as the personal project for a local group I mentioned earlier, you still have to submit an application to the IRB. They are the ones who will determine that your research is exempt. Now, one of my many jealousies of my historian friends and colleagues is that since they mostly study dead people, they never have to seek IRB approval. Those of us in the social sciences, medical and health sciences, and other areas of research that study humans and their behavior get to know and love your IRB. Actually, doing an IRB application is a great exercise, even if you don't strictly need to get permission from them for your research. A typical IRB wants to know the point of your project. So that means they want your research question, a brief literature review, and a detailed write-up of your methodology. As with a grant proposal, this forces you to be very methodical about how you plan to approach your research. If you're doing a survey, they want to see your questions. Conducting interviews, they want to know the topics and any specific questions. Planning to run an experiment? They want the full details of your controls, pre-tests and post-tests and treatments. It's like going through a mini peer review prior to starting your research. Remember that I said you have to do this before you start, right? You aren't allowed to begin data collection until you have IRB approval. No setting up interviews, no distributing surveys, no recruiting participants for your experiment. You aren't allowed to have any contact with your subjects until you've convinced the IRB that you're aware of the potential risks your subject may face and that you're prepared and able to protect your subjects from harm. That means you'll also have to answer questions about what possible harm your subjects might face by participating in your study, including psychological, emotional, and reputational harm. They will want to know how you will protect the confidentiality and anonymity of your subjects. They want you to justify the use of any deception too. And if you're working with vulnerable populations, they want you to address their protection. They also want to know how you will store your data and keep it secure. Once you file your application, it'll be reviewed by the IRB and designated to one of three categories: exempt, expedited review, or full board review. Exempt research is that which by its nature imposes no foreseeable risk to subjects. We just discussed some of those categories. Exempt research can typically get approved in a very short period of time, as usually just one person has to review the application. Expedited research poses minimal risk to subjects, meaning that the harm they face is no greater than that which they might experience in their normal daily life. Medical research involving routine and non-invasive procedures, or behavioral research that doesn't involve stress or risk of personal or legal harm if their participation was exposed, are examples of expedited research. Typically, a small number of IRB members, 2 or 3, would review this kind of application. A full review covers everything else and typically requires the approval of the entire ethical review board. Anything that involves intentional deception, invasive procedures, or focuses on sensitive or stressful topics, or where there's any potential for more than minimal harm to the subjects, will require full board review. Regardless of the level of the review, the IRB will evaluate the research proposal to make sure that risk to subjects have been minimized, that the researchers are ready and able to care for their subjects and their data to ensure minimized harm, and that any potential harm is outweighed by the potential benefits of the research. Now, the IRB isn't doing any of this to cause you headaches or delays. They do it because they are charged with protecting human subjects from researchers. They're helping us strike the balance between advancing knowledge and protecting those persons whose participation is necessary for us to do so. Remember, past history has shown that researchers without regulations can be very dangerous. Ethical review boards are there to protect people from our curiosity. It's great that we have questions, but others shouldn't have to suffer in any way for us to find our answers. If you violate the basic ethical principles we've discussed here, consequences can vary. If you've published your work, it may be retracted. You or your institution might lose any federal funding. If you violate ethical principles after an IRB has approved your research, the IRB may lose its standing and ability to grant approval to other projects. You could be reprimanded, suspended, or fired. Certainly your reputation will take a hit. Some states have stricter laws than the federal government. In California, failure to obtain informed consent can, depending on the circumstances, result in a fine and time in jail. Hopefully you'll follow the ethical principles we've discussed here for their own sake. But for the instrumentalists among you, be sure to keep the ramifications that I've just described in mind. Both you and your subjects will be glad you did. In order to undertake your own research project, you of course need to choose a topic. But a topic alone won't get you very far. What you really need to develop is a research question. To help you see what I mean, I'm going to give you a writing assignment. I want you to write an essay on your favorite hobby. Your entire grade in this course, did I mention that this course is now graded? Will be based on this essay. Go. Okay, I'm kidding. But how long would it take you to come up with a hobby to write about? For some of you, you might have thought of something instantly. For others, it might have been more of a struggle. Between work, family, and other obligations, we might not have much time for hobbies these days. For those of you with time for lots of hobbies, the difficulty might not be in thinking of one, but picking one amongst many interests. Let's say that after some thought, you settle on something. Maybe it's cooking or stamp collecting or playing a sport or instrument. I enjoy knitting, so that's the one I'm going to pick. Hobby chosen, it's time to put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard. Where to start though? I have to write an essay, but our frustrating instructor, me, has given no real instructions. What exactly am I supposed to say about my hobby? Am I supposed to write about the benefits of knitting? My favorite projects? Why knitting is my favorite of all my hobbies? Or should I write about the history of knitting, either how I got started or about how knitting shifted from a household must to a hobby? Any of these would be a fair place to start an essay on my favorite hobby. Let's say that I decide to write about the benefits of knitting as a hobby. The next question is, what do I do once I've gotten started? Should I write this essay in the first person from my own perspective or as a third person, more scholarly work? Do I need to cite sources? Should I provide physical examples or photos of my knitting projects, either to illustrate my ideas or give evidence that I do, in fact, spend some of my time knitting? Again, this is frustrating because I don't know the answers. I just have to do the best I can and hope it's what my mean instructor wants. Finally, when do I stop? The instructor gave no word count or page limit. How many of us have written papers and said to ourselves, just 2 more pages and I'm done? In the film Back to School, Rodney Dangerfield's character, Thornton Mellon, is a businessman who hires people to do his schoolwork for him. One underling hands him a term paper and he weighs it in his hands for a moment before handing it back and telling him it's too light and it feels like a C. In his mind, more was definitely better, no matter what the essay actually said. So these 3 problems, where to start, how to proceed, and where to finish, pose significant challenges to my producing a paper on knitting that's worth reading. So what does a paper on knitting have to do with doing research? Well, as you can see, having a strong sense of purpose to a project is really important. It's not enough to choose a topic, in my case knitting, and just start writing. There's so many directions that I could take such a topic. I have no focus for my research or my writing. Without that focus, it's less likely that I'm going to produce good work that's worthy of being read. Now, part of the problem is that our terrible instructor gave us almost no direction on how to proceed. That lack of transparency is completely her fault. Sometimes in our own projects, someone is providing some kind of direction for our work, perhaps a supervisor or a colleague. But frequently, our projects are self-generated. We study something because a topic fascinates us, or because our livelihood depends on us writing something. So the question then becomes, how do we get started? And how can we be sure that once started, we will be able to produce something worth reading? Most research starts with a topic, but the key point of this lesson is that while starting with a topic is fine, you shouldn't end with a topic. Ultimately, you need to come up with a question, and one that's worth answering. So let's return to our knitting example to explore why. Imagine our instructor asked us to write a paper answering this question. What is the history of how your favorite hobby became a hobby? Note how this immediately changes the focus of the essay. This essay isn't about my personal experience with knitting, why I like it, or even how I came to be a knitter. Instead, I'm supposed to write about the history of knitting. Think about how this immediately changes the focus of my essay. I now have a good idea of where to start. I need to look into the historical origins of knitting and its transition from being a necessity to produce clothing into an optional hobby. That might require me to talk about changes in the garment industry and the mass production of cheap cloth and clothing. This gives me direction for my essay. I also know this shouldn't be a first-person essay about my experience, and I'll probably need to cite many sources as I report back on this currently unknown history. I should probably only use illustrations to the extent that they help tell this story. Finally, I know something about where to stop. I stop when I've answered the question as fully and completely as I can. I might still want to know the anticipated product, as that might tell me how detailed I should get, but hitting the page limit is no longer sufficient. I have to answer the question. So it's clear that moving from a topic to a question is an important step in the research process. But how do we go about selecting a topic in the first place? Sometimes that topic is chosen for you. You might have been asked by a supervisor to evaluate a particular program. Colleagues may have brought you in on their project, or a client may ask for assistance in solving a problem. If that's the case, great. But what if you need to do research and produce a paper, presentation, talk, or poster? You have complete control over the topic and you don't know where to start. The best way to start is to think about something that interests you or your intended audience. Whatever topic you choose, all things being equal, you want it to be something that you genuinely want to explore in great depth. Otherwise, you might find yourself prone to procrastination and lackluster effort. I have some personal experience with this. When I was working on my PhD, I started a dissertation in one area. I spent almost 2 years avoiding working on it because it was hard and because I didn't really care much about the topic. I made almost no progress in that time. I then switched topics to studying something that I was very interested in. Within 2 years, I not only had made progress, but I actually finished my dissertation and earned my PhD. So take it from me and pick something that you find really interesting. If nothing comes to mind immediately, try a quick exercise. Take out a piece of paper and make 2 columns. The first column is topics I know a lot about, and the second one is topics I'd like to learn more about. Write down as many as you can think of in both columns. Consider conversations you've had with friends or colleagues, what you studied in school, books you like to read, interesting events during a recent people-watching session, or news stories or articles that you gravitate toward when you read or watch the news. Be as broad or as narrow as you like. Write down anything that comes to mind. This is a brainstorming session, so don't censor yourself right now. Once you've done this, see if there are any natural connections here. You might see 2 topics that you know a lot about, but you've never explored their connections before. For example, 2 topics I know a lot about are theories of international relations and the television show Survivor. Synthesizing those 2 might give me a great research project. There's actually a lot of IR theory that's relevant to that show. You might see something in the second column worth studying in its own right. Or you might find that considering two topics there, or one from each column, sparks some kind of interest. For example, maybe you know a lot about the history of France, but would like to learn more about cooking. I'm seeing a project focused on the history of French cuisine in your future. If you're still having trouble finding something, look to recent research in your field. Skim through the table of contents in academic journals, a conference program, or the recent publication list of some publishers. See what kinds of topics are pursued by recent authors, and note down which ones sound the most interesting to you. If you really find yourself struggling to find a general topic, you might want to jump straight to a research question, as you might actually find that easier. Coming up with a question is our next step anyway, so now let's turn to those and consider the characteristics of good research questions. Now, before we start, a caveat. Keep in mind that what constitutes a good research question can really depend on your discipline and field. Many projects, such as our knitting example, call for describing historical events in detail. In other projects, however, you might want to focus on a description of events or causes and explanations. In such a case, your question shouldn't ask what happened, but why did that happen? I might, for example, want to ask what factors caused the transition of knitting from household necessity to hobby. In the course of answering such a question, I'll need to describe those past events, but only in service of the claims that I am making about the causes. Or your research might be more applied, in which case your research question could be something like, what are the strongest solutions to this problem that I have identified? Here, describing the problem is important to understanding all of its dimensions, but by itself, the description is insufficient. You're going to need to gather data, research existing solutions, and perhaps conduct experiments to design your own. Here are some general guidelines for coming up with good research questions. While the specifics may vary from one field to another, they tend to have three main characteristics. These are: questions are unanswered, appropriate in scope, and empirical. First, good research questions are unanswered. Remember that research, whether it's scientific, historical, journalistic, or something else, aims at producing new, original knowledge or answers. That new knowledge may be based on original data or on new interpretations of existing data. As you explore the literature, you may discover that someone has already answered your question. That may mean that you have to find another one, but don't change course just yet. Just because someone else has written an answer to your question doesn't mean that your question has been definitively answered. There's lots of room for debate in science, as well as in other research-based fields. Take a deep breath, read the other researchers' work, and evaluate it. You may find that you disagree with their assumptions or conclusions, or that their explanation makes some logical missteps. Maybe their answer applies in some cases, but not yours. All this means is that your area of interest is further along in the research process than you thought, and your incremental contribution just starts a bit further down the line. The idea that good research questions should be unanswered is actually twofold. First, it means that your question should be about something that doesn't have an easy factual answer. So your question shouldn't be about trivial things. If you can find a definitive answer in a quick internet search, this isn't a great research question. If that's the case, then find a relevant article or report and send the link to whoever was interested in the topic. Project completed. Second, make sure your question allows you to enter a debate, solve a puzzle, fill a gap in knowledge or understanding, solve a problem, or otherwise make a contribution to your audience. The best way to do this is by doing a literature review, which we'll cover in a future lesson. Basically, this means you need to read through what other scholars have already written on this subject so you can figure out where your ideas can fit in. Let's look at an example. Say you're interested in global warming or climate change as a topic. One question you might have is global warming real? Given the research that has already been done on the subject, that's not a great question to explore unless you already have expertise in the field. You'll quickly discover that there is widespread consensus that it is real. There are both natural and man-made cycles of warming, and the vast scientific consensus is that the current cycle of warming is largely man-made and causing shifts in average global temperatures. This isn't the kind of question that's going to lead most of us to create a great research project. But there are plenty of questions that you could ask on this topic. How about, why is there continued skepticism of man-made climate change in the United States given a scientific consensus of its existence? Now, this question is not answered. There are lots of potential explanations for it, from the way media portrays the issue, to partisan politics, to broader skepticism of science, to the role of religion and ideology in the United States. A puzzle is at the heart of this question, the tension between scientific certainty on the one hand and public uncertainty on the other. If you're more policy-oriented, you could ask a different question. You could ask, what kinds of policies are most effective at reducing the behaviors that lead to man-made global warming and climate change? Again, there's lots of debate on this question, and you can make a genuine contribution by comparing different policies and their effects. Now, note that to ask either of these questions, you may have had to ask some initial questions, such as, what is climate change? What causes climate change? And our initial question, is climate change real? It's perfectly normal to start with these answered factual questions so that you can gather the information necessary to ask a good unanswered question. Our next characteristic of a good research question is that it is appropriate in scope. Sometimes you need to adjust the anticipated product to meet the scope of your question. For example, if you're tasked with writing a blog post, don't pick a question that requires a book-length answer to do it justice. In school, you might have gotten away with reducing the font size or margins to make your work seem shorter or longer, but in the professional world, you're gonna have trouble doing that. I once wrote a 35-page paper for a class where the page limit on the assignment was 7 pages. I reduced the font size so that it was almost illegibly small, and I turned it in. All 7 pages of it. I would like to take this time to offer my apologies to my 8th grade English teacher, Mrs. Dubinsky. That was really uncalled for. I'm pretty sure no editor would let me get away with it now, and to Mrs. Dubinsky's credit, neither did she. At the same time, sometimes one research paper becomes 2, or program-wide evaluation spurs into individual evaluations that are narrower in scope. A single idea may turn into an entire research agenda. If that happens to you, just make sure that changing the ultimate product is fine with the editor, client, supervisor, or whoever else might be expecting it. It may ultimately be a great thing. Some of my favorite authors have planned a single novel or a trilogy and ended up resulting in many more books. But other times, you'll have to limit your approach to the expected product. If we take our question about the most effective policies for addressing climate change as an example, that might be a book-length question. If you need a shorter report, you're going to want to narrow the scope of the question. Perhaps you'll focus on just the policies at the local level of government, or on best practices promoted by businesses, or a case study of a specific city's or business's approach. Or, as I said earlier, you might want to adjust the size of your product so you have the space to consider all aspects of your question without sacrificing necessary detail. Another aspect of scope has to do with considering your own abilities and limitations. You need to think about the kinds of data that you're going to need to answer your question. Does it exist? Do you have the time and resources to acquire it? Do you have the skills to interpret it? For example, let's go back to our "Is global warming real?" question. I said it was a bad question to research, and for most of us it is. But for climatologists, the scientific experts whose general consensus I referenced earlier, this is a totally valid question. Climatologists are continually evaluating incoming data to adjust their explanations and predictions regarding climate change. But for the rest of us, we don't have the training to analyze this data, so joining in that project doesn't make a lot of sense. So you have to consider your own training skills and resources. In our climatologist example, new data is coming in all the time. The data exists, but only certain people with the right skills and training can interpret it. In other cases, the data might not exist. And you don't want to pick a question where the data is non-existent and impossible to get. We can consider hypotheticals about the future, but we can't actually study it, unless you happen to have a time-traveling DeLorean or TARDIS, of course. Time is always a factor. You may have a set deadline and want to make sure whatever question you choose is one that can be answered in whatever time frame you have. Other factors to consider include whether or not your project requires extensive work with numbers or people. Some of us like interviewing people about their lives, while others would prefer to crunch numbers. If you really hate talking to strangers, make sure you pick a question that won't require you to interview people, or that you find a collaborator that can handle that part of the project. If working with numbers scares you, then you might want to pick a project that's less quantitative in its needs. You also need to think about your language proficiencies. It's great to be interested in the history of French cuisine, as we discussed earlier, but if your French is in poor or non-existent shape, you might not get very far. I had a colleague in graduate school who pitched our research group on a research question comparing two countries, Japan and Turkey. We kept trying to talk him out of it until he told us that he was fluent in both Japanese and Turkish. What had seemed like a poor question became perfectly fine once we realized that he would have access to the data needed to answer it. There's one final thing to consider for our focus on finding an appropriate scope for your question. Is your question going to require funding for you to be able to complete the project? Your question might be about the cultural practices of people who live on the other side of the globe, which means to answer it, you might need to fly there and stay for a while. This means that your question needs to not only be interesting to you, but important enough to grant institutions that they will want to support you while you do your research. Other projects might be much larger in scale or require specialized equipment or personnel, increasing the need for grants. Okay, our third characteristic of a good research question is that it is empirical. Empirical research questions ask how the world works. They're based on events, phenomena, and actors that can be observed in the world. To really understand what we mean about research being empirical, it may help to contrast it with normative work. Empirical work, as we just noted, is about objective processes that aim at observing how the world actually works. Normative questions and claims, in contrast, are subjectively based judgments about how we might want the world to work. What does this mean? Well, let's start with a norm. A norm is just a shared code of behavior. It's a set of usually unwritten rules that a group has for interacting. All members of the group know the rules, and they often don't even think about them, even though they regularly obey them. Does that seem hard to believe? Well, let's do a test. When you go into an elevator, where do you stand? Do you turn around to face the doors? Do you move immediately to occupy a wall or corner as someone else gets in? If you do, guess what? You're responding to norms. Imagine you go to a movie theater. It's packed. There's one seat left in the entire theater next to a young woman and her friend. You sit next to them. Seems totally normal, right? Now, imagine that the theater is entirely empty except for this woman and her friend, but you sit in the same seat. No longer normal, right? One is fine, the other a total norm violation. There are norms about everything, about behavior in bathrooms, about eating, while in a meeting, standing in lines, greeting people, and much more. Typically, these are unwritten. You either know them or you have to figure them out. You can violate them, but there may be social, if not legal, consequences for doing so. And of course, norms change by location, culture, group, and time. In the United States, you might shake someone's hand to greet them, while elsewhere you might bow or kiss them on the cheek. What you do at home may be very different from how you behave in public or amongst strangers. Norms about dating have certainly changed over time. So when we talk about normative questions, we're talking about questions that prescribe or judge behavior. By their nature, these questions are asked from a subjective standpoint, and they tend to produce subjective answers. Now, this is fine in our everyday lives. But when it comes to research, it can be a problem. If we base our findings on what we hope to be true or what we think might be good or bad, we're more likely to cherry pick information to support our own ideas and conclusions. It's also very difficult to provide evidence for a subjective statement. Let's look at two questions to get a better idea of the contrast. Question number 1, should people adopt a cat? Question number 2, what is the impact of adopting a cat on people? Question number 1 is normative. It asks about what people should do rather than about what people did do. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but by itself, it's probably not going to lead us to a doable research project. That second question is empirical. We could create a study that would let us determine and evaluate the benefits and costs of cat adoption. And consider, answering that second empirical question will give us the tools to answer the first normative question. My project may be motivated by considering whether I should adopt a cat, but I can only answer that by doing an empirical study on the benefits and costs of adoption. None of this means that normative questions are bad. Quite the contrary. Some fields, such as ethics, focus primarily on normative questions. But in terms of using the scientific method, we can't focus solely on normative questions because we need to make observations about the world. In other words, engage in empirical work to get data. But normative questions are often essential to motivating our work. Let me explain. Consider these normative questions. Should our city fund a new public transportation project? Should our company change its management practices? Should our country invade another country? Should we adopt this new program in our community? All of these are important normative questions that ask about potential policy changes or actions. You can see how asking them might motivate you to learn more about that subject. But consider, to really answer these questions, you have to ask empirical questions too. So, should we fund a new public transportation project? Well, to answer that, you need to know about the finances of your institution, the costs of such a project, the benefits, the challenges, the history of past efforts at creating local public transportation, and the experience of other cities. That requires getting data about the world, and only after all of this empirical research can you answer the normative question. You're only going to change your management practices if you have empirical data about why your current ones aren't as effective as some potential new ones. And hopefully, decisions about invasions are going to be based on empirical data. One final note on this. Your research interests may be about the future, how a policy may play out over the next 10 or 20 years, or other kinds of predictions. Plenty of research projects aim ultimately at making predictions about the future, and that is fine. But to do that, we usually need to understand the world of the past and present. In other words, we need to do empirical work that allows us to make those predictions. So, ask your normative questions. They motivate our work, they help us develop recommendations for action, but then move quickly to the empirical question that will allow us to effectively answer the normative question. That is essential to solid scientific research. All right, we have 3 characteristics of good research questions. Let's close out today's lesson by discussing some tips on how to write one. Tip number 1. Start your question with the 5 W's and H. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. Who, where, and when tend to be more sparsely used, as these might lead you to ask previously answered or trivial questions. But for descriptive, comparative, action, or evaluative research, these can work just fine. Ask, who are the people most harmed by this policy? Why and how are the best for asking questions about causes and outcomes? What is a great starter for questions about policy, practice, and scope? Examples of question starters might be, what are the most effective? Or under what conditions does X affect Y? Or what kind of policy might solve X problem? Tip number 2, try to avoid yes-no questions. The key to all of these question starters is that they're hard to answer with a simple yes or no. Yes/no questions are fine in some situations, but they can lead us down the path of trivial answers. Typically, once we know that an answer is yes or no, we immediately want to know why. So instead of asking, is a carbon tax the most effective policy for addressing climate change? You could ask, what is the most effective policy for addressing climate change? Then, no matter what the answer is, you'll have something interesting to say. This also helps you avoid ethical issues about wanting to try to prove a particular answer correct. Tip number 3. Don't make assumptions about the answer. When we get to writing hypotheses, you'll make your best guess about a possible answer to your question. For now, avoid writing a question that presumes a specific answer. For example, you could ask, why are eggs a healthier breakfast option than cereal? But that presumes that eggs are healthier. Depending on what we mean by healthier, that may or may not be true. Instead, you could ask, what is the healthiest breakfast food option? Eggs might be the answer, but you're not presuming that from the start. Tip number 4, don't complicate things unnecessarily. Your question might be, is my program meeting its outcomes? Or what are the causes of this phenomenon? You might revise this later to be more specific, but you don't have to write the perfect question from the outset. Do the best you can, but get something down on paper so you can start doing a literature review. You'll have plenty of opportunities to revise your question as you learn more. And remember, it's better to answer a narrow question well than a large question poorly. Think of it like doing a jigsaw puzzle. You need to keep that big picture in mind, but ultimately, it comes down to finding 2 pieces that fit together and moving on from there. It's only as you build it section by section that that larger picture will show itself. Tip number 5, use the literature. The scholarly literature on a topic is a great resource. A lot of scholarly works will end with the authors suggesting questions for future research. You can look to those for ideas on what your questions should be. Journalists, policymakers, entrepreneurs, their work may also inspire you. As you prepare to do your own research, you'll want to consult scholarly literature for another reason as well, to find out what others have already learned. We'll focus on that in our next lecture on literature reviews. I want you to imagine that you walk into a cocktail party alone. There's lots of people here, all mingling in pairs or small groups. You spot a group of people that you recognize as sharing a common interest of yours. In fact, let's say they are acknowledged experts in this community, and you join their group. But this is no ordinary group. Everyone here is an acknowledged expert on this subject. Let's say it's Shakespeare. And they are in a deep discussion. You wedge yourself into the circle, and without waiting to hear exactly what they're saying, you interrupt the current speaker and launch into your pet theory. Well, I think that the works of Shakespeare might have been written by someone else. Imagine the reaction. Not only did you just rudely join a conversation without bothering to listen to the actual subject of discussion, but your pet theory is one that has been discussed to death in Shakespeare circles. It's hardly new or innovative. How likely is it that your ideas will make any contribution to the conversation, or that this group of people will want to include you in their future conversations on Shakespeare? You won't be going home with any phone numbers or social media contacts. You'll be seen as a total bore. Imagine instead that upon joining the group, you listen intently to what everyone has to say. The more you hear, the more you realize you don't know. So you seek out more perspectives, still listening. The ideas these other people are bringing up cause you to question and refine your own. And then, once you understand the various positions and debates, you weigh in with your own thoughts, building on the arguments already expressed and pointing out gaps in logic or a missed piece of evidence. How do you think your contribution will be received in this case? It's much more likely that the group will want to listen to you and take your ideas seriously, both now and in future gatherings. This is why the literature review matters when you're doing research. The lit review is where you dig deep into what scholars and other experts have already learned on your topic. This lets you build your own work on the back of what they have done. Remember our previous discussion about how science is cumulative? How are you supposed to add to that knowledge base without taking the time to learn what we already know? The literature review is where you do that. You find out what we know, and you build your work on top of it. This lets you add to the conversation with the assurance that you are making a genuine and valued contribution. So, don't be a cocktail party bore. Do the literature review. Now, most people, when they say that they want to do research, typically they think of going to the library or heading online and looking for sources and information. Actually, we gather information at least twice in any study. The second time is when we get our actual data, the statistics, surveys, experimental results, reports, or historical analysis that will let us assess our claims. It occurs much later in the process after we've designed our entire study. The first time is right now, when we review the scholarly literature on our question and find out what is already known on the subject. Let's define our terms. The literature is what we call the body of scholarly work on a given question or topic. It's a bit of an odd term. It's not really referring to novels or stories, so no Jane Austen or Toni Morrison here. Instead, we're talking about the work that scholars and scientists have completed and published in a particular area. So, you might review the collective work of literary scholars about Jane Austen. We'd call that the Austen literature. Or you might refer to the string theory literature in physics, or the deviant behavior literature in sociology, or the Tudor dynasty literature in history. A literature review, then, refers to both the process of finding and evaluating this body of work for your chosen topic or question, as well as the section of your report or presentation where you share your conclusions about the literature. So first, you find the literature, read it, and then draw conclusions about what we do and do not know. Later, you will produce a section of your report, written or oral, that explains the key claims of that literature, the themes, debates, gaps, methods, and overall conclusions drawn from this review of scholarly work. Now keep in mind, the literature review is not optional. Doing one is not simply about saving yourself from embarrassment. Consider it your entrance ticket to that cocktail party. After years of drop-ins derailing conversations, the organizers now require you to show your academic medal as the price of admission. Likewise, conducting a literature review and demonstrating you've done so by including it when you share your work, that's required to have your work taken seriously by a research community. No literature review, no grants, no publication, no accolades. Now, this can seem elitist. If your ideas are brilliant, why should you have to go through the effort to read the work of others? Well, even Newton and Galileo's work came about as a response to the work of their contemporaries. They knew what others were saying, and they challenged those ideas, and in so doing, changed the course of scientific history. We tend to venerate the individual in Western society, but that's not how scientific research works. You need to understand what ideas are out there and their strengths and flaws before you're able to really advance our understanding of the world. If you don't do the literature review, you don't even know whom you're challenging. That circle of scientists at our cocktail party might include Albert Einstein, Marie Curie, and Stephen Hawking. But because you haven't bothered to find out who else is working on the subject you care about, you don't even recognize them for who they are. How embarrassing for you. They will definitely be talking about you after that party's over, but not for the reasons you might want. Okay, hopefully I've convinced you now that there are a lot of negative consequences if you don't do the literature review. So let's talk about the positive side. Let's consider what kinds of things you might get out of doing a literature review. There are a number of practical things we can learn from reading the work of other scholars that will help us build our own study. You can learn where mistakes were made and identify best practices that will help you build your own research design. Specifically, you'll find common and accepted definitions for the concepts and variables you plan to use. You'll learn which concepts and variables are important in the first place. You will see what cases have been studied and which ones haven't, perhaps providing a clue for where you can make a contribution. You'll learn what kinds of qualitative or quantitative methods are generally employed to study this question and what sources of data are out there. You might even find an unanswered research question or untested hypothesis that you can tackle yourself. So many of the questions that you might have about designing your study can actually be answered in a thorough review of the literature. But wait, there's more. Reviewing the literature also helps us in bigger picture tasks too. Collectively, the literature is going to tell us about the state of theory and practice in this particular area. It can help us identify the debates that scholars have, the scope and limitations of existing theory, unexplored gaps of understanding, practical examples where policies and programs have or have not worked, and connections to other fields or areas of study. A thorough read of the literature is what starts many researchers on their projects. They see something that other scholars have missed, or a way to resolve an existing debate, and that's their point of entry into the discussion. Okay, now that we've learned about what to look for when we read through the literature, let's talk about how to identify and find the specific sources that you need. Scholarly sources are going to be the key to any literature review. A scholarly source is a book or journal article that is written by an expert, written for other scholars, and has undergone peer review. That is, other experts have evaluated that work and deemed it worthy of publication, usually in a double-blind process. That simply means that neither the author nor the reviewers know the identities of those involved. The goal is to ensure that the work is evaluated based purely on merit. Typically, we avoid non-scholarly sources in the literature. A non-scholarly source is a book, article, or other source that has not undergone scholarly peer review. Examples might be a newspaper article, a magazine, blog, social media post, or a self-published book. Even if the author is an expert, if the source isn't peer-reviewed, it's not typically considered a scholarly source. Some of these sources can still be useful, but they're only rarely considered part of the literature. So how do we identify a true scholarly source? Well, let's look at those 3 criteria I mentioned, but let's explore them in a little bit more detail. So first, scholarly sources are written by experts. So let's look at the author's credentials. The author will typically hold a terminal degree in the field. That's the ultimate degree that one can obtain, or they'll be in the process of acquiring one. The author also will usually have an affiliation with a university, think tank, or reputable research-based agency or organization. If you can't find any information about the author's credentials or they don't meet that level, it's probably not a scholarly source. Second, scholars write scholarly sources for other scholars. If the intended audience is the public, students, government officials, company executives, or friends and family members, it's usually not considered a scholarly source. This is pretty easy to identify. If there's a lot of indecipherable jargon and charts, few pictures, no colorful, glossy paper, and citations and footnotes galore, in other words, if it looks a bit imposing or downright impenetrable, congratulations, you've probably found a scholarly source. Now, this will vary by discipline. Over in art history, you will certainly find more color and photos. But generally, scholarly sources often have a high bar of entry for the average reader. A common critique lobbed at academics in the ivory tower is precisely aimed at this point, that they only talk to each other, and not the people who might be affected by or use their work. Whether you agree with that critique or not, for now, looking at evidence of the intended audience will help you identify what is generally considered a scholarly source. The final and most important criterion is that a scholarly source be peer-reviewed. A good way of determining whether this is the case is by examining the publisher. Is it a university press like Princeton, Oxford, or Stanford? That's usually a good sign. Likewise, an academic journal such as Chemical Reviews will conduct peer review of all submissions. If you review the publisher information, it should have a clear section that discusses its review process, so look for peer review. Keep in mind that all three criteria must be met for a source to be appropriate for the literature review. A textbook, for example, that's usually written by experts and it's often published by a prominent university press. But since the main audience is students, not scholars, textbooks are generally not considered scholarly. Apply the three criteria, you should be fine. Okay, now that we know what to look for, we need to know where to look. One way to find the sources that you need is to find one or two highly relevant and recent journal articles on your topic. That's right, just one or two articles are really all you need. Remember when I said that scholarly articles are usually full of citations and footnotes? Well, why do the work of tracking down a ton of citations when other scholars have already done that work for you? Find one or two really good recent articles on your research question, and you've got the key to the core of the literature. Go to the bibliography, track down the articles you see there. Then do the same with those articles. Keep going and note which articles keep popping up in the bibliography. The ones that keep showing up, those are likely the core of the literature on the subject. Now, once you start doing a lot of research in a particular area, you'll get to know who the big names are and which articles or books are considered the most central to current debate. You might even meet the authors at a conference. But when you're just getting started in a new area of research, this snowball method of finding sources can be really useful. Another thing you can do is check the number of citations for a given article. Google Scholar will report that information if you do a search using the article's title. A high citation count means that article has been consistently cited by other scholars in their work. It's a good sign you've probably found a core part of the literature. Another option is to ask a mentor. Your mentor may already know the big names in this field and might be able to direct you to some of the core works that you need to know. Now, to find those one or two articles that I suggested in the first place, you have a couple of options. You can head to your local university library, if there's one near you, and browse the stacks of bound journals. Or if you go to the website for the professional association in your field, it should identify some of the top journals in your discipline. For example, the American Political Science Association publishes the American Political Science Review, a top journal in the field. You could pull out a recent edition and start browsing until you find a relevant article. Searching databases on the internet might be quicker though. Try a catch-all database like EBSCO, Academic Search Premier, or JSTOR. Enter in a few relevant search terms and narrow the responses to scholarly sources. You can use the provided subject headings in an article's description to further narrow your results. Now, that's all great with anyone that has access to a university library, but many people don't have that option. Still, you'll be able to find some sources available through free search databases like Google Scholar. There are also subscription services that let you rent journal access on a monthly basis, like Deep Dive, or sites like academia.edu, which allow authors to upload their papers. Your public library may have some resources, and it's possible you may have alumni access privileges at an institution that you previously attended. Finally, some journals, particularly those in the natural sciences, have moved to open access formats, which allow free public access to their publications. Now that we have a pile of sources, let's talk about what to do with each of them. Journal articles can seem difficult to decipher at first, but they follow a fairly standard format once you know what to look for. Let's look at one and learn how to understand what we're reading. The journal Science published an article called "Protecting Unauthorized Immigrant Mothers Improves Their Children's Mental Health" on August 31st, 2017. The authors ask their research question in the first paragraph. They want to know the impact of a parent's unauthorized status on a child's well-being. The last sentence of their first paragraph begins the literature review section of the article, as the authors note that their study is filling a gap in existing literature. The lit review then continues for the next 3 paragraphs as the authors note relevant studies that connect parental immigration status to child development. And they note the methodological issues that have prevented a full understanding of this question. Then they outline the nature of their study, the subjects, sources of data, specific variables used, method of analysis, and then they turn to their results. They close with the implications of their results and possible steps for future research. It's important to take notes during this process so you can find your way back later to any sources you found and any important ideas that occurred to you along the way. So first, before you write down any source's research findings, note down its bibliographical information, as well as the page or paragraph number of any material that interests you. If you want to save yourself some time later, you can upload that information into a citation manager system. They're now included in many word processor programs. That will actually create a bibliography for you with a single click. But for now, just make sure you know exactly where each idea and finding came from so you don't have to go back and look it up again later. Next, for each article or book, take notes on its claims, research design, and implications. Note down exactly what the authors claim to contribute, as well as the details of the research methodology they use to evaluate those claims. Now, try to paraphrase whenever possible. As you read, you may question the process or results, particularly as you start going through multiple articles on the subject. Note down those issues too, and note any connections or contradictions to other articles that you've already read. At this stage, it's really important to clearly distinguish between what the authors are saying and what you think about what the authors are saying. I like to use a yellow highlighter for my own thoughts and put the word me at the start of any ideas I have. That makes it clear to me what is my original contribution, and it also prevents any accidental plagiarism. With our science article, you would note the full citation and then mark down the research question, the gap it claims to be filling, the methodology the authors use, and the key findings. If you have any questions, ideas, comments, or connections to note, you're going to put those in your notes as well, but use a different color or highlight them, bold them, whatever you like. Just make it clear that that's your analysis and commentary and not what's found in the article itself. Now, you're going to repeat this process with all of your sources. Depending on the size of your project, you may consult 15, 50, or 100 or even more sources. You want to be comprehensive, so use the sources you are reading as a guide. If they're citing an average of 25 sources, that's a good number to aim for. The final step, now that you've evaluated the individual sources, is to draw and eventually present your conclusions about the literature. Remember that the literature tells us about the state of knowledge on your chosen topic. So that means the point isn't simply to report that Scholar X said this and Scholar Y said that. A list of sources and their contributions and findings, or those notes we just took, we call that an annotated bibliography. This is a source-by-source list of the important characteristics and findings of each book or article. It's an initial first step to writing a literature review, but the literature review itself requires you to go further. So instead, you need to identify the core findings in the literature. This means you have to explain what's known about the answers to your research question. This might be consensus on a set of definitions, or a methodology that scholars tend to use to study this question, or agreement on which range of theories are most germane to the subject. But you also have to explain what's unknown. If we already know everything, there's no need for your project. So what specifically should you look for? Well, there are a lot of comparisons to make as you synthesize your sources and write your literature review. You might, for example, look for common themes across the sources that keep popping up. Or you might look for gaps, issues, or ideas that the authors seem to miss, but that you think are really relevant and maybe worth exploring in your own project. Another way to organize your thoughts is to look for debates between authors. Where do they disagree? And is there room for you to enter the debate with your own contribution? Are there different theoretical perspectives that you encounter that are in contradiction to each other? If so, that might be a way to organize your review of the literature. One last thing to look for are methodological choices and debates. You might note that the dominant methodology used to study similar questions to yours is quantitative, which means that a qualitative approach might provide some new insights. What this means is that a literature review is not simply a paragraph about what each author has to say. Instead, you should focus your writing on one of those methods, using themes, gaps, debates, or methodology to organize your thoughts. You cite sources as a type of evidence supporting your argument that this theme, gap, debate, or methodology is a useful way of understanding the current scholarly approach to your topic. Let me illustrate this approach. Imagine we're doing a project on whether democracies are more peaceful than authoritarian regimes. After reading a bunch of sources, I determined that scholars generally disagree with this idea. Democracies are not more peaceful in general, they just tend not to fight other democracies. In my literature review, I may have a paragraph explaining that initial idea of the peaceful democracy, famously credited to Immanuel Kant, and follow it with a paragraph citing the scholars that disagree with that premise. Then I might turn to the different explanations for this democratic peace theory, the norms of democratic societies, the constraints of legislative activity, and the fact that war is just pretty rare in the first place. Then I might look at limits to the argument, the conditions when these explanations don't hold up. Or I might examine the methodologies most commonly used to study this question and try to define my terms as they're used in the literature. Finally, I might identify an existing gap that I intend to fill in this literature. So now it's your turn. Take a look at the notes you've written. Try to group sources together according to these themes, debates, gaps, methods, or issues that they discuss. Each section of the literature review should focus on exploring the nuances of these points, and you use those literature as your evidence. Make the authors talk to each other. It's almost like you're recording the conversation from our cocktail party earlier. It's not a transcript of each individual speaker, but a record of the conversation, out of which you are noting the most valuable collective points. Okay, so we just walked through the steps on how to conduct a literature review. Now that we've learned how to do one, let's make sure we really understand why going to all that trouble is an absolutely vital first step of our research. I'm going to give you some examples as to what can happen if you don't do a proper literature review. Here's the thing. At some point, research is going to require you to put in a lot of work. It has to happen on either the front end or the back end, and you are almost always better off by putting in the work early to ensure good results later. It's kind of like baking. Have you ever tried to make cookies or a cake? You know how the instructions tell you to properly grease the pan? Have you ever skipped that stage and just put the cake in the tin or the cookies on the sheet and thrown them in the oven? If you have, and I have, you know that when they come out, they still look great, right up until you try to get the cake out of the pan and it won't come out. Instead of a perfect looking cake, you'll get one with bits missing that you then need to fill in with frosting. Trust me, I once learned how to make chocolate ganache simply to cover a cake that had holes in it due to improper greasing technique. Now, if I had just gone to the trouble of properly greasing at the start, it would have saved me a lot of heartache later on. Now that I've made you hungry, let's get back to the literature review. It's the same thing. Doing the literature review upfront is going to save you a ton of time and frustration later on. So for example, say you want to do a survey of your community's perspective on a national issue, let's say healthcare policy, and you want to compare it to the national results. You could skip the lit review and come up with a series of questions yourself and send out your survey. But your questions will not adhere to the standard ones used in national surveys, and that means you can't actually compare your results. Your only options are to either throw out your results and start over, or give up the ability to really compare your results to those national numbers. If you had done the lit review first, you would have learned about those national standards, saving you the trouble of creating your own questions and ensuring you could compare your results. That extra work on the front end would have saved you a bunch of trouble. Here's another example. Let's say you want to study what kinds of government have been the most warlike since 1945. To do that, you're going to need a definition of whether or not a country has fought a war in a given year. Well, what counts as a war? World War I? The Korean War? The War on Terror? The War on Drugs? If you use the number of officially declared wars in the United States as your measure, you're quickly going to be in trouble. Only 5 wars in US history had official Senate declarations attached to them, and all of those occurred by 1942. There are plenty of other definitions that you might come up with, but here's the good news. International relations scholars have already debated this issue. One of the most commonly used data sets for the study of war, the Correlates of War project, settled on a definition of war: sustained combat involving organized armed forces, resulting in a minimum of 1,000 battle-related fatalities within a 12-month period. Now, your entire study hinges on having a strong, accepted definition of war, and failing to use a conventional definition makes it less likely that your work will be accepted, much less published. Anyone familiar with the literature will reject your work because you didn't do your homework, sending you back to the drawing board. Now let's say you're a lawyer. If you're representing someone and you haven't done your literature review, which is reviewing the relevant case law, you are going to be killed in court. You might even be sued for malpractice. You need to know what opinions have been issued, keep up with changes in the law, and not make any assumptions that the law in one state is the same as in another. Lawyers are always under tremendous time pressure, but the good ones don't ever skip their literature reviews. Their careers depend on it. And lest you think I'm immune to this myself, think again. I already shared my mistake with the cake. That, at least, had a happy, chocolate-filled ending. But one time in graduate school, I cut corners in a presentation at a conference, and I didn't do a full literature review. I just charged ahead with my own ideas. Someone in the audience called me out on it, and they noted an important book that was incredibly relevant to my topic. It was mortifying, and I almost quit graduate school over it. But ultimately, it was helpful. It taught me the penalty of not putting in that work up front. Professional embarrassment. I backed up, I read the book, and you know what? My work ended up being a lot stronger. The novelist Brandon Sanderson, in his book, The Way of Kings, writes, quote, "Given 2 works of artistic majesty, otherwise weighted equally, we will give greater acclaim to the one who did it first. It doesn't matter what you create, it matters what you create before anyone else. The greatest talent we think a man can have, seems to me, it must be nothing more than novelty." End quote. Novelty is indeed prized, particularly in research. But to be novel, you need to know what's original and what's derivative or repetitive. And the only way to do that is to figure out what's already been done. The Lit Review is your pathway to novelty and acclaim. If you want to be a great researcher, do your literature review. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to generate hypotheses and theories. This is typically the 3rd step in the process of doing research. We've already discussed how to identify a problem or a question and reviewing the literature. Now, it's time to start considering our possible answers. Let's start with theory. Theories are generalized explanations for what we observe in the world. They play an important role in driving basic research. Observation tells us what to expect. We all know that what goes up must come down. Theory helps us understand why that is the case. Now, research isn't always about building or testing theory. Sometimes we just want to observe or describe rather than explain or understand. Sometimes, as in action research, our goal isn't to explain broader patterns, but to find solutions for specific people, groups, or organizations. But a large swath of research is focused on explanation, and frequently, understanding why can help you apply ideas to new cases and events, and even let you make predictions. Anytime you are interested in why or how things happen, or you want to fit an event into a larger pattern or trend, we're gonna want theory. Theories have to be tested by data. While you can use inductive reasoning to form theories from observation and data, there are dangers if we just stop there. It can lead to what is called data fitting. In other words, basing our theories on the data we have, which may not be comprehensive. Remember when we talked about how our personal experience is no substitute for research? It's the same idea. If you form all of your ideas based on your own personal experience, you're gonna have a very limited view. Likewise, we don't simply build theories out of the data we have and assume that they are true. Instead, we observe, we form theories based on those observations, and then we test those theories against new data. We also value parsimony in our theories. This is a quality drawn from the Occam's razor principle, that the simplest explanation is usually the best. Parsimony means that when everything else is equal, we prefer simpler explanations to complex ones. We want to maximize the story that a few variables can tell. If I can explain some outcome using just 1 or 2 variables, that's going to be considered a stronger theory than if I need 10 or 12 variables. But we don't want to oversimplify and lose the causal power of our theory. If the explanation really does require those 10 or 12 variables, then it's better to keep a complex but accurate theory than to go with a simpler but less accurate one. So how do you develop theory? Well, start by thinking systematically about how and why one variable of interest affects another variable of interest. Theory is often about unwrapping those causal mechanisms that get us from point A to point B. If I theorize that cats make people happier than dogs do, it's not enough to just say that they do and test that. I need to be able to explain why cats lead to greater happiness. I might argue that since they are easier to care for, they put less strain on their owners. Or I might point out that cats, once armed with a water fountain, food, and litter boxes, can be left on their own for a few days. That means a vacation costs less, since there's no need to arrange for a dog sitter or kennel. And that means either more money in my pocket or more frequent vacations, both of which might make me, a cat owner, happier than a dog owner. Let's take a different example. Democratic peace theory, which we've touched on previously, argues that democracies tend not to fight each other. They aren't less warlike than non-democracies. They just tend to resolve conflicts with other democracies without going to war. Now, this is an empirical finding that, with few possible exceptions, generally holds true from 1815 onward. But nothing I've said yet is theory. Theory requires an explanation of how or why this empirical relationship between type of government and likelihood of war might be true. Why is it that democracies tend not to fight each other? Many political scientists have focused their entire careers on answering this question. There are many possible explanations, but let me outline 2 of the more prominent ones. One explanation focuses on the nature of democratic institutions and how they restrain political leaders. The other explanation focuses on norms, that democracies as like-minded countries tend to promote less violent ways of resolving conflict with each other. Now, I am vastly simplifying here, but I hope you see the point. Understanding how democratic institutions or norms might make a democracy more or less likely to engage in war, that is the very essence of theory. And that theory helps us understand why a particular empirical finding in the data might be true. To develop your theory, first look to the literature. See what kinds of explanations are already offered and examine whether the evidence in the literature supports those explanations. Are there gaps that aren't explained? cases that seem to contradict the general findings, debates that aren't yet resolved. All of those are fertile grounds to spark your own ideas. Another way is to engage in some observation. At an early stage of your research, examining data can be a useful way to generate theories as well as hypotheses. Eventually, you will want to subject these theories and hypotheses to proper tests, but initially, you're going to need some knowledge on which to base your theories. One thing I like to do is to draw arrow diagrams. I put my outcome of interest, say, war between countries, on the right side of the paper. And then I start diagramming out possible factors that could affect the likelihood of war increasing or decreasing. I will draw arrows between these factors, linking them. As new factors arise through my reading of the literature or thinking through empirical puzzles, I put those on the diagram, trying to figure out how these factors might be related to each other. The more I read, observe, and test, the more refined my diagram becomes. The key is ensure that your theory helps answer your research question and it aims at explaining general principles, not just specific cases, and that it advances our understanding of the phenomenon of interest. Now that we've introduced the idea of theories, let's turn to hypotheses. Now, hypotheses are testable statements that provide the researcher's best guess at an answer to a research question. Hypotheses are typically derived from theories, although sometimes it works in reverse, and testing hypotheses helps us build theories. For example, I could hypothesize from our earlier discussion of democratic peace theory that countries with democratic systems of government are less likely to fight each other than they are to fight non-democracies. That is a testable statement. We could design a study that looks at the war habits of democracies and see who their opponents have been, other democracies or non-democracies. If we find that there's no difference in their opponents, that they're just as likely to fight other democracies as non-democracies, or that they're maybe more likely to fight democracies, that would actually disprove our hypothesis. Now, if in our study we find evidence that supports our hypothesis, note that this doesn't mean that we're automatically correct. We may be right, but we haven't proven our case. Let's take a moment and talk about that word, prove. I have a rule in my classes. The word prove is banished, exiled, not allowed under any circumstances. If a student uses that word on a paper, it gets a giant red no next to it. If the students say it out loud in class, I stop everything until they correct it. If they do it twice, I throw myself to the ground in a fit, and they can only resurrect me if they explain why I treat the use of the word prove like a literal blow to the head. Why does a single word bother me so much? Simply put, proving is not very scientific. In science, we set out to disprove, not prove. When you prove something to be true, that means it's pretty final and definitive. That's why in math they use proofs, and in legal courts they speak of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In many research areas, pretty much everything is uncertain and conditional. We are rarely 100% positive about anything. We find evidence that supports a theory or hypothesis or refutes it, but there is no single piece of evidence that can prove our ideas correct. So instead, we set out to disprove ideas. It's what we're left with, the ideas that have been tested but not disproven, that form the foundation of scientific understanding. So why is it that if we find evidence to support our hypothesis, we shouldn't assume that our hypothesis is definitely correct? Well, there are a couple of reasons. First, it's possible that it's only correct for whatever data we happen to look at. It might be that if we had more data or from different sources or over a longer time frame, that the results would be different. Our hypothesis about democracies not fighting, that comes out of the democratic peace theory, one of the more famous findings in political science. The data largely supports the hypothesis, but War itself is actually exceptionally rare. It might be that we just haven't had enough wars in the period following the American and French revolutions to really assess who fights whom. So our data might be incomplete, missing, or flawed. A second reason we can't just assume our hypothesis is correct is because there might be alternative explanations that account for the relationship we suggested. In our example, we did find evidence that democracies tend not to fight each other, but they have fought non-democracies. But maybe it's not the system of government itself that matters, but economic conditions. It could be that countries in higher stages of development are both more likely to be democratic and less likely to fight each other because of the impact on wealth and markets. Other scholars have suggested factors such as common national interest or use gender-based arguments to explain the democratic peace theory. I hope you can see how closely theory and hypothesis intersect. Theory, by increasing our understanding of why and how things happen, and sometimes the causal mechanisms underlying the why and how, can also help us assess our hypotheses and findings. A hypothesis without theory, it's like a birthday cake without frosting, incomplete, unappetizing, and likely to end up in the trash. Now, some research focuses just on developing theories, and that is fine. Who amongst us doesn't like to lick the frosting, even if there's no cake to put it on? But ultimately, if our goal is to advance knowledge or be reasonably confident that our ideas are correct, we need to examine empirical evidence. That doesn't always require a hypothesis to test. Sometimes we're looking for themes or describing our findings or engaging in critical analysis. Other times, we are doing research to figure out the variables that might play a role in affecting our outcomes of interest. You can't really write a hypothesis because you don't know what variables to use. Completely reasonable. Hypothesis testing might come later or not at all. So if your project doesn't lend itself to hypothesis testing, that is fine. But a lot of research does involve constructing tests to evaluate hypotheses. And having a hypothesis can be an advantage in that it provides guidance for our research. Just as a research question provides more guidance than a simple topic, a hypothesis can help guide you towards a specific research design and provide a framework for your analysis. So just in case that your research is focused on developing and testing hypotheses, let's talk about how to write a good hypothesis. There are some rules to keep in mind. First, in keeping with the idea that we are never 100% certain about anything, hypotheses are typically probabilistic. If we state a hypothesis in an all or nothing sort of way, there is no room for nuance, random chance, or exceptions. For example, consider a hypothesis that says that owning cats always leads to more happiness than owning dogs. Now, the dog owners amongst you are probably bristling. As a cat lover, this seems perfectly plausible to me, but all I would have to do is find a single person for whom that statement is not true, and my entire hypothesis is incorrect. So instead, why not hypothesize that owning cats is more likely to lead to happiness than owning dogs? Now, we're set up to evaluate patterns. When I find that strange dog lover, they no longer completely refute my hypothesis. Instead, they're a single data point that I will evaluate to determine larger patterns. If I find that 75% of my happier pet owners have cats, that would still support my revised hypothesis. For my less probabilistic hypothesis, the one that uses always, it'd be wrong from the start. 75% is still an interesting finding and worth knowing. So we write hypotheses probabilistically. That usually means using words like more likely or less likely rather than always, never, or will when we write our hypothesis. A second rule for hypotheses is that they are written about general groups or concepts, not specific people. So consider this hypothesis. My cat Xander is more likely to make me happy than my dog Obi. Do any of you really care which of my pets makes me happier? Probably not, or at least not more than idle curiosity or outrage over the implication that I might rank my pets. Xander is the cutest, by the way, of my 3 cats. But more to the point, would any funding agency want to give me money to conduct research on such a hypothesis? Would anyone want to publish my results? Would my boss care? No, of course not. Now, those same groups might care if I were able to say something more broad about cat and dog ownership. My boss is probably just tired of seeing my cat photos on social media. This is why hypotheses are written in a generalizable way. That is, in such a way that they apply to broad groups, not specifics. We write hypotheses about cats, about food, about general behaviors such as obsession, not about my cat Xander or what I ate for breakfast this morning or about how I might be obsessed with my cats. A third feature of hypotheses is that whenever possible, they should state a specific proposed relationship between variables. What this means is that your hypothesis should specifically state something you expect to find when you examine the empirical evidence. That's what allows us to design our research to create a strong test. We're testing whether or not the data supports the existence of this proposed relationship. If we don't state what that relationship is, our tests won't have any purpose to them. There are generally 2 broad categories of relationships that we look at. They're correlation and causation. In a hypothesis that focuses on correlation, you're stating that you expect to find a relationship of some kind between true variables. You might indicate what kind of relationship you expect to find. Do you expect that as one variable increases, so too does the other? Or do you expect that second variable to decrease? For example, consider our hypothesis that those who own cats are likely to have higher levels of happiness than those who own dogs. This states a specific relationship between 2 variables, type of pet owned and level of happiness. We're saying that people who fall into one category of that first variable, cat owners, are more likely to be happy than those who fall into that second category of the variable, dog owners. This is stronger than hypothesizing that pet ownership and happiness are related, which is less specific but purer form of a correlation-style hypothesis. So correlation looks at whether or not there is a relationship between 2 variables, and plenty of hypotheses focus on that. The second broad type of relationship is a causal relationship. In causal relationships, we're investigating whether or not one variable causes change in the other variable. We aren't just looking to see whether there are patterns in the values of 2 or more variables. We're looking to see if specifically change in one variable causes change in another. Our pet ownership hypothesis is actually a causal hypothesis. We're stating that pet ownership causes a change in happiness levels. It takes the idea of testing for a relationship one step further by claiming that one variable is the cause and the other the effect. We have language for this. When we're talking about our cause variables, the ones we think are affecting some outcome of interest to us, we call those our independent variables, and we usually refer to them by the letter X. In an experiment, our X is the variable we're manipulating. It's the drug we're giving to subjects in medical research. It's the characteristics of the name used on a fake resume in a study on racial or gender bias in hiring. In our study on whether type of pet owned matters in terms of happiness, it's whether or not you own a cat or a dog. The other type of variable, the outcome or effect, is called the dependent variable, and we use the letter Y to refer to it. This is whatever phenomenon we're studying, that thing that's changing, and we want to understand why it's changing. A lot of research starts by finding an interesting dependent variable and then thinking, I wonder why that is. Your independent variables, or X's, they're often the answer to that question. So in our pet ownership example, the Y is happiness. That's the outcome we want to explain. In our democratic peace example, the Y is whether or not states fight wars. In a study where we administer drugs for medical research, the Y is whether or not the medical condition improves. We're going to use this language of independent and dependent variables, x's and y's, throughout the rest of the course. One final point before we move on. Keep in mind that at some point you should indicate the conditions under which you expect the hypothesis to function. It may be that the relationship you expect is only likely to occur for adults, or only for people in the United States, or only for women. If your proposed relationship is limited in that way, you're going to need to state that, either in the hypothesis itself or in your explanations. We have one more feature of a strong hypothesis, and that is it should be falsifiable. Now for this, we need Austrian-born philosopher Karl Popper. Popper argued that hypotheses must have falsifiability. That is, that they're written in such a way where they can be disproven. For Popper, falsifiability is so important, it's actually what distinguishes science from non-science. Now, if my hypothesis is that there's a giant monster living in a lake in Scotland, can that be disproven? Not really. Despite no evidence beyond a blurry photograph, plenty of people still think Nessie is out there. There's no definitive way to disprove her existence. So this is also why it's difficult to scientifically test religious ideas. Religion is about faith, not about proof or disproof. This is also why most research is actually testing what's called the null hypothesis rather than a hypothesis itself. Every hypothesis has a null hypothesis. A null hypothesis simply states that no relationship exists between our variables. That's it. There is no relationship between x and y. And that's actually what we're setting out to disprove, because if we can disprove the null, that means that some kind of relationship does exist. Perhaps the one we hypothesized, or maybe something else that we weren't expecting. We're going to return to the null later in the course, but for now, it can be helpful to think about it. Even though we're talking about our research as testing a hypothesis, knowing that you're actually setting out to disprove a null hypothesis can help you sort why we disprove rather than prove. So that's 4 features of a strong hypothesis that you should consider when you're writing your own. That they're probabilistic, generalizable, they state a specific proposed relationship between variables, and they're falsifiable. Now, there are some templates that you can use to construct your hypotheses that follow these rules. They're not going to fit for everything you want to study, but they can be a good help to get you started. The first template is as follows. Value 1 of x is more likely to lead to value 1 of y than value 2 of x. That's a mouthful, sorry, let's break that down. What this template is saying is that one category or value of a variable, x, is creating a particular effect on our second variable, y, and that some second category of x is not having that effect. We're stating a specific relationship between the variables. x1 is having this effect, but x2 is not. x1 and x2 are the values on your independent variable. So if you're studying whether cat ownership leads to greater happiness than dog ownership, then your x is type of pet owned, x1 is cat ownership, and x2 is dog ownership. Your y is happiness. So let's say that we're using a very simple high and low happiness as our values for y. So if we plug these inputs into our template, this is what we get. Value 1 of x, cat ownership, is more likely to lead to value 1 of y, higher levels of happiness, than value 2 of x, dog ownership. Or simply, cat ownership is more likely to lead to higher levels of happiness than dog ownership. Our clear relationship is there, which gives us something to test. Also, by using variables, we're staying general. We're talking about general groups, not specific cats, dogs, or owners. It's falsifiable. We could find evidence disproving the statement. And it's also probabilistic. We're not saying that value 1 of x always leads to value 1 of y, just that it's more likely to than value 2 of x. That comparison across the independent variable, x, is clear. We're ready to test. Of course, sometimes we have more than one x to consider. In our example so far, we've been looking at a single x with 2 possible values, cat owner and dog owner. Sometimes we have multiple x's in play, each of them with multiple possible values. If I'm trying to explain pet owner happiness, for example, perhaps owning a cat versus a dog isn't the only factor that matters. Maybe in addition to type of pet owned, I want to consider how many pets the owner has. The more the merrier, right? You can always add more X's into that template. You might state that people who own multiple cats are more likely to be happy than dog owners or those who own just one cat. Now, that's not the only way to write a hypothesis, of course. I'm going to give you a second template, but this one comes with a caveat. It is easier to write, but you're more restricted in when you can use it. The second template is, there is a blank relationship between X and Y. See, much simpler. Fill in the blank with positive, negative, curvilinear, or other descriptors of the relationship, and you are done. No messing around with values or anything else. Try, there is a positive relationship between the number of cats owned and happiness, or there is a negative relationship between the number of dogs owned and happiness. Let me actually explain those terms. A positive relationship is one where the two variables vary in the same direction. So as one goes up, the other goes up, and as one goes down, so does the other. A negative relationship is the reverse. The variables are going to vary in opposite directions. So as one goes up, the other goes down, and vice versa. Let's examine a sample hypothesis. I might argue that as you increase the number of cats you own, your happiness will increase. I may also be claiming that a decrease in the number of cats you own leads to a decrease in happiness, or just generally that your happiness level is directly correlated with the number of cats you own. These are all positive relationships. I might also argue that the more dogs you own, the less happy you are, and the fewer dogs you own, the more happy you are. That would be a negative relationship. Now remember, at this stage, we have not examined any evidence. We don't know whether or not these hypotheses are correct, even if they are striking you in a visceral way that is making you either nod your head enthusiastically or trying to reach through your speaker or headphones and shake me until I come to my senses. I'm using this example not because I necessarily think it's true, but because it makes for an easy way to understand these concepts. An emotional reaction means you really understand what I'm trying to explain. There are two restrictions to using the second template. The first is that these kinds of hypotheses really only establish correlation, not causation. If you just want to test whether two variables are related to each other, then this can work fine. If your goal is to figure out if one causes the other, however, this hypothesis style doesn't really clarify that for you. The second restriction is that for this style to work, your variables need to be at a certain level of measurement. That is, it needs to make sense that a variable can go up or down, or increase or decrease. Some variables we may want to study don't make sense in that way. As an example, take the variable marital status. Consider the traditional categories or values of that variable: single, married, divorced, and widowed. And now let's say that we think marital status is correlated with happiness. So we write a hypothesis. There is a positive relationship between marital status and happiness. Think about what that's saying for a second. Remember, positive and negative are not normative judgments. They're words we use to represent a type of relationship. This sample hypothesis claiming a positive relationship is basically saying that as marital status increases, so too does happiness, and vice versa. That doesn't make sense. Remember, our marital status variable is defined as one of 4 discrete categories or values: single, married, divorced, and widowed. And a positive relationship means that as this variable increases, so too does happiness. What does that mean for marital status to increase? There is no ranking or numerical ordering of single, married, divorced, or widowed. Is divorced more or less married than widowed? It just doesn't work. To use this second template, you need 2 variables where increasing or decreasing makes sense. So we could change our marital status variable to number of marriages. Then our hypothesis would be there is a positive relationship between the number of marriages and people's happiness. From a hypothesis construction perspective, that makes much more sense. But we had to change our variable entirely to do this, which we may not want to do. If we're really interested in the role of marital status in affecting happiness, we probably need to use that first hypothesis template. So we could hypothesize that people who are single are more likely to be happy than people who are married, divorced, or widowed. Now, there are plenty of other ways to write hypotheses, so do not feel bound to these templates. But when you're just getting started, it can be really helpful to have a format to follow. So use these as a starting point. Before I conclude this lecture, I just want to point out that science in theory and science in practice can differ widely. I've told you today that as researchers, we set out to disprove theories and hypotheses, and that we design our tests based on our hypotheses. In the real world of research, though, this does not always happen. There are a lot of incentives in place to not do this. For example, it's much more difficult to publish negative results than positive ones. In other words, if your evidence confirms your null hypothesis and rejects your hypothesis, that's very important to know and exactly the kind of falsifying that Karl Popper would applaud. But it's not as sexy as results that support a hypothesis, and therefore it's much more difficult to acquire grant funding for such research or to get it published. It's also true that sometimes scientists will just run various models on their large data sets, and then when they hit on a finding, pretend that this was their hypothesis all along. Now, I don't advise this or support it as a practice. It can lead to data fitting, and it doesn't necessarily advance the state of knowledge. But it can be an effective way to get results that can be published. And for a lot of researchers, particularly academics at big research universities, getting published is one of their primary goals. Their careers depend on it. My caution to you is that there are strong reasons to follow the rules of scientific inquiry when it comes to research. Ethics demand it, and for many of the projects you're doing, it is just as important to know what doesn't work as what does. There are always going to be incentives to avoid or bend the rules. My advice, try to resist those incentives. Now that's all for now, and we're at the end of our section on the fundamentals of research. Next time, we will start digging into everything that goes into designing our research project.